Ever wake up at 2 a.m., mind racing, staring into the dark ceiling, wondering why sleep feels harder than it should? What if I told you that medieval peasants, yes, those who lived with no heating, no memory foam beds, and no blackout curtains, actually slept better than we do today? They had a secret rhythm to the night, a hidden wisdom that modern science is only just beginning to rediscover. Tonight, let's slip quietly into the shadows of the past and uncover how medieval people mastered the art of perfect sleep. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you'd like more calming journeys into forgotten worlds. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Now, let's step into the dark. The forgotten rhythm of the night. Not every hour of the night was meant to be silent. In the world of medieval Europe, when the stars blinked through soot-stained skies and hearth fires settled into slow embers, sleep didn't arrive all at once. It came in waves, soft, thoughtful, and patient. When darkness fell, people drifted into what they called the first sleep. It wasn't rushed. There were no alarms, just bodies settling on straw or wool-stuffed mattresses, covered in heavy woven blankets, wrapped in quiet. And then, after a few hours, something curious happened. One by one, they woke up, not from restlessness or worry, but because this was how sleep was meant to be. For roughly 2 hours, between their first and second sleep, homes stirred gently. No bright lights, no panic, just a soft rising. A period the French once called dorveille, the watching hour. A blacksmith might step into the cold and check his kiln. A farmer might stroke his beard in the candlelight and scratch notes into a ledger with his ink-stained thumb. Mothers might mend a tunic by the fire. Children stirred, then stilled. Monks whispered their midnight prayers in thick-walled abbeys, and lovers sometimes whispered too, drawn together in this quiet middle world between dreams. It wasn't considered insomnia. It wasn't even strange. It was life. Bifurcated sleep, what scientists now call biphasic rest, was simply the natural order of things. 2 sleeps, 1 peaceful break in the middle, a time when thoughts were clearer, conversations deeper, and dreams easier to recall. This wasn't just a quirk of the Middle Ages. It turns out, when modern volunteers were placed in total darkness for several weeks, their sleep naturally split into 2 phases, just like it had for centuries before. In the stillness of night, without the hum of electricity or the glow of screens, something ancient stirred in the human body, a rhythm, a pulse, a return to something deeply familiar. During that midnight pause, towns stayed dark, but minds were bright. In some households, journals were kept just for the between-sleep hours, little cloth-bound books filled with candle-flickered musings and dreams remembered from the first sleep. A woman in 14th century France once wrote that her best poetry came in the hush, between sleeps, when even the dogs do not bark. Some considered the thoughts that came during those hours to be sacred, illuminated, almost prophetic, not fully of the waking world, not quite part of dreams, just suspended. And the darkness itself helped. Medieval nights were truly dark, thicker and deeper than most of us can imagine. No headlights, no blinking clocks, no glow under the door. In many towns, candles were rationed. Rushlights, slender, slow-burning strips of plant dipped in fat, glimmered faintly, just enough to trace the shape of your own hand. To our eyes, it might feel claustrophobic, but for them, it was perfect. Their bodies responded in kind, melatonin rising with dusk, sleep deepening like a lake at midnight. There was no blue light to confuse their rhythm, no night shifts, no 24-hour news, just the rise and fall of sun and shadow. In fact, hospitals of the time valued the midnight wakeful period so much, they used it for crucial observations. Nurses recorded that patients often spoke more clearly and remembered more during these hours. Some even received their medicines between sleeps, believing the body was most receptive then. To many, this space between the sleeps became the most thoughtful part of the day. And then, just as gently, it passed. The candle burned down, the embers dimmed, a yawn passed from one person to the next like a ripple, and second sleep began, not with resistance or stress, but with a sense of readiness. The mind calmed, the body heavier. This final sleep stretched softly toward the horizon, until dawn's first light crept in through shutters, and the roosters stirred. Sleep wasn't just a necessity, it was a ritual, shaped by darkness, community, and silence, and it worked. So as we lie in our beds tonight, wondering why the stillness feels so loud, we might consider that we haven't lost the ability to sleep. We've just lost the rhythm, and maybe, just maybe, that rhythm still waits for us, somewhere in the quiet folds between our first dream and the second. A darkness deeper than sleep. There is a kind of darkness we no longer know. In cities today, the night is never truly night. There's always a glow, street lamps spilling light into bedrooms, screens blinking softly on nightstands, cars casting pale trails across the ceiling like restless ghosts. But in the medieval world, once the sun disappeared, the dark was almost total. Not just outside, where winding alleys folded into ink, but indoors too. Inside cottages, castles, monasteries and farms, night pressed gently against the walls. Light was precious, and darkness was expected. There were no bedside lamps, no hallway nightlights, no blue-lit clocks. A single candle could cost as much as a day's wages, and even the wealthiest families counted their wax. Many homes owned just 3 or 4 candles at a time, some wrapped carefully in cloth and stored like treasure. They didn't light them casually. The firelight was reserved, used for prayer, or reading, or just enough sewing to finish a hem. When the wick burned down, that was the night's way of saying, "That's enough now." And so most people fell asleep in true darkness, not just dimness, not shadows, but a kind of velvet black stillness that wrapped around them like wool. Sleep came not just because the day was long, but because the night was ready. This wasn't just poetic, it was powerful. Modern researchers have found that true darkness triggers the human brain to release melatonin, the hormone that prepares the body for rest. But even a small amount of artificial light, like a phone screen or hallway glow, can reduce melatonin production by over 80%. Medieval people didn't need to manage their screen time. They simply lived in rhythm with the sun. When dusk came, their bodies responded. Slowly, gently, naturally. In towns and villages, curfews weren't just for safety. They were laws protecting the dark. Records from London, Paris and Prague mention laws against lighting fires or candles outdoors after a certain hour. Light, after all, could cause trouble. Not just fire hazards, but disturbances. Light was noise, and noise stole sleep. A town council in Flanders once fined a man for keeping a lantern burning past the bell. A curfew toll meant to signal the hour when public lights must go out. "He who wastes light at night," one scribe wrote, "steals sleep from his neighbor," and sleep was sacred. Even architecture adapted to protect it. Homes were built with thick shutters that closed out the moonlight. In cities, tall buildings blocked the stars, making the night even darker. Inside, walls were covered with light-colored plaster to reflect what little candlelight they used. In wealthier homes, builders carved light wells, open shafts to carry daylight down into lower floors during the day. At night, those shafts carried only silence. In monasteries, sleep was almost a spiritual science. Monks slept in large dormitories, their beds lined in rows, their night habits tied just so. Many monasteries had darkness keepers, assigned monks who walked the halls after evening prayers, snuffing out stray flames, ensuring no unauthorized candles burned through the night. Darkness was discipline, and with it came rest. Hospitals, too, followed this practice. Medical records from 13th century infirmaries show that sleeping chambers were kept almost completely dark, with thick cloth over the windows and oil lamps used only sparingly. Nurses noted that patients in darker rooms seemed to heal faster, though they didn't know about hormones or sleep cycles. They called it the soothing properties of shadow, and perhaps they were right. In the dark, the body lets go, it sinks, it forgets the ticking of time. A young scribe in a monastery once wrote, "When the candle dies, the body remembers how to breathe." He was writing about the moment the flame gutters and the dormitory falls still, that deep moment before second sleep begins. For medieval people, darkness wasn't feared, it was trusted. They could navigate their homes by feel. They knew the creak of the third stair, the softness of wool underfoot, the chill that came through the window seam just before dawn. In rural villages, people knew their animals by sound alone. A farmer could tell the difference between a restless sheep and a fox in the henhouse without ever opening his eyes. The dark sharpened their other senses. It became part of their memory, their intuition. One 15th century watchman in York wrote that he could tell the hour of night by the insects he heard singing in the hedges. Crickets changed their tune near midnight, he claimed. He was rarely wrong. Modern people often speak of being in the dark, as if it were a bad thing. But medieval people found meaning there. They whispered secrets in the dark, because words carried farther when no eyes watched. They contemplated dreams in the quiet between sleeps, because the world seemed thinner, more flexible. They prayed, not out of fear, but out of a sense that something was listening in the hush. Not all was peaceful, of course. Darkness could hide danger too, thieves, animals, spirits, but even fear had its rhythm. There were night watchmen, bell towers, dogs who knew when to bark and when to listen. And for most, the darkness was an ally, a cradle, a gentle gate. When dawn came, it wasn't announced with alarm clocks or morning emails. It came slowly. A pale ribbon on the horizon, a shifting of weight in shared beds, the sound of chickens, the first step on cold stone, and then they rose, not from sleep alone, but from a kind of full-body reset, a night not filled with panic or interrupted thoughts, but with true rest. We often chase sleep with supplements and gadgets, apps and advice, but perhaps the answer lies not in something new, but something old, something dark, something quiet, a room emptied of glow, a bedtime that follows the sunset, not the screen, a trust that in the dark, the body knows what to do. As we lie here tonight, flickering screens just out of reach, maybe we can dim them one by one, close the tabs, the curtains, the eyes, and remember, there was once a time when darkness was enough, and in that darkness, perfect sleep waited patiently, like it always had. The bed was never yours alone. In the modern world, sleep is often imagined as a solitary retreat, a soft mattress, your own blanket, the door closed to the world, privacy, quiet, separation. But in the medieval world, sleep was rarely a solo experience. The bed was not yours alone, it was shared, expected to be shared. Sometimes by family, sometimes by guests, sometimes by people you'd only just met. To modern ears, it might sound strange, maybe even uncomfortable. But for medieval people, this kind of closeness was as natural as sunrise and bread. A bed was not just a place for rest, it was a resource, a shared warmth in cold winters, a gathering place after long days, a necessary economy in a world where firewood was precious and heating more than one room was a luxury few could afford. It's there, tucked into the corners of records and letters and household guides, a portrait of a world where sleep meant togetherness. Take, for instance, the story of an innkeeper in York, fined for giving two travellers separate beds. The magistrate's ruling was blunt. It is against custom and wastes good firewood to heat multiple chambers when guests can share warmth. The travellers, it seems, had no complaint, but the city did. Heat was not to be squandered. Even in the most ordinary cottages, families often shared a single room and a single bed. Parents in the middle, children on either side, small squirming furnaces that radiated warmth through the long dark hours. One old farmer wrote in his will that his bed should go to his eldest daughter, for she knew well how to order the little ones to sleep. Not with lullabies, but with practiced arms and careful arrangement. They had systems. Medieval household guides from England, France, and the Low Countries give instructions: the youngest and warmest sleepers should lie in the middle. The elderly or frail should lie near the edge, for easier rising. Everyone should sleep with feet pointed toward the fire, if there is one, and heads away from drafts. Children were not merely comforted, they were heat sources, living, breathing, giggling hot water bottles. In larger homes, guest rooms were often just space near a bed. Visitors were expected to share, especially in winter. A traveling merchant wrote of being pressed in sleep between two local men, one who dreamed aloud and the other who snored with a vigor fit for trumpet. And yet he made no complaint. Only a note: he charged the innkeeper 1 coin less the next morning for breathing difficulties during the night. In monasteries, where order reigned over all things, sleep was shared with formality and purpose. Monastic dormitories were vast halls, rows of beds aligned with near-military precision. Most monks slept two to a bed, with written rules on distance, posture, and conduct. The beds were narrow, the covers thin, but the order was absolute. One set of rules from a Benedictine abbey warned: excessive nocturnal shifting shall be considered a disruption to the peace. Another forbade any speaking after the last bell. Stillness was a spiritual duty, yet even here, warmth mattered. In winter, monks were permitted to sleep closer, to share heat, to bend the rules just enough to keep the cold from creeping too deeply into their bones. But it wasn't only in monasteries or inns. The very idea of the shared bed shaped society in small, quiet ways. There were expectations, rituals, even for how one behaved in a bed not entirely their own. Bed sharing came with conversation, yes, but also with silence. With the gentle respect of turning just so, of understanding that space, however small, could still be given. People grew accustomed to sleeping beside others, They knew the weight of another breath near their ear, the shared shifting of blankets, the warmth of shoulders. For many it was comforting, reassuring, a part of life, like bread and bells. And when disagreements arose, the bed knew that too. One humorous tale tells of a couple who, after a heated dispute, spent the night facing opposite walls in silence, yet waking tangled as a reminder that the body sometimes forgets the quarrels of the mind. In some towns, records even show bed sharing as a form of alibi. In Bruges, a woman accused of theft was acquitted when 3 bedfellows confirmed she'd not left their shared chamber all night. Their testimony, clear and unshaken, held because the bed was considered a place of full awareness. One did not easily forget the presence, or absence, of another beneath the covers. Even travelers wrote of the strange intimacy of sleeping beside strangers. A French noblewoman, journeying north, described a night spent beside a Flemish baker and his daughter. "We spoke little," she wrote, "but the girl's breathing was sweet as lavender, and I found comfort in her steady dreams." The bed, for all its closeness, created quiet connections, not always lasting, not always spoken, but real, all the same. There were practical benefits too. A warm bed meant better sleep, and better sleep meant better health, better moods, better work. In a world without central heating, the most efficient furnace was each other, and privacy. It was simply a different idea, not the kind we imagine today, 4 walls and a locked door, but a kind of emotional privacy. A shared silence that was honored, a closeness that did not demand conversation, a trust that even among strangers, sleep was a sacred thing. And so, night after night, across towns and fields and cloisters, people nestled together. The world outside may have been hard, cold winds, long hours, uncertain days, but in the bed, there was warmth. In the bed, there was peace. Tonight, as we lie alone or beside someone else, wrapped in blankets or quiet thoughts, perhaps we can remember them. The peasants and pilgrims, the monks and mothers, the bakers and builders, sharing dreams, sharing space, sharing sleep. The room may be different, the world may have changed, but the warmth of a shared breath, the rhythm of another heartbeat in the dark, that perhaps is timeless. The quiet between sleeps. In the modern world, if you wake up at 2 a.m., mind humming, eyes wide open in the dark, it can feel like a problem, something broken, something wrong. But to a medieval villager, that hour between midnight and dawn would have felt perfectly natural, even useful. They would have called it the watching hour, a gentle space between 2 worlds, a time when the world was still, and yet somehow more alive. It was not a disruption to sleep, it was the shape of it. Most medieval people practiced something modern researchers now call biphasic sleep, a rhythm where the night unfolded in 2 distinct chapters. First sleep, then waking, then second sleep. It all began when the sun dipped behind the hills and lamps were snuffed one by one. With no artificial light, the body followed the sky. Darkness came fully, and with it, sleep. The first sleep would last about 4 hours, deep, still, dream-heavy. Then, the stirring. Not dramatic, not sudden, just a gentle rise, a slow awareness. The room still dim, lit only by the faintest embers or a single rushlight candle. And in that tender space between sleeps, the household would shift into quiet life. Husbands and wives might murmur softly to one another, quiet conversations that never made it to daylight, small confessions, gentle laughter, plans whispered beneath the blankets. Elsewhere, monks in stone-walled monasteries would rise in silence. They moved barefoot across cold floors to candlelit chapels, where they sang the night office, a sacred ritual of psalms and prayers offered in the deep black of night. For them it was the holiest hour, a time when the soul was clearest and most open to the divine. Not everyone prayed, of course. Some worked. In one town, a brewer would use the midnight hours to tend his mash. The temperatures were better then, cooler, steadier. In another village, a baker would begin kneading dough, her hands moving in rhythm, with the flickering light of a single beeswax candle. The bread would rise slowly through the night, ready for the morning fire. Letters were written, tasks were done, mending, carving, embroidery, small things, gentle things. One noble woman, writing from her estate in Burgundy, described the hour as her most lucid and golden. It was, she said, the only time she could write poetry without interruption. "The house sleeps," she wrote, "but my mind it dances." A cloth merchant in Ghent kept his books by candlelight during these hours. He claimed he did his best math at night, Something about the hush helped the numbers settle more clearly in his mind. Even in hospitals, the hour was respected. Nurses logged that patients spoke more clearly, more thoughtfully, in the dark between sleeps. Medicines were often given at this time, and symptoms recorded. It was said that a man's true pain speaks only when the world is quiet enough to hear it. The watching hour had a different texture than daytime. It wasn't busy, it wasn't efficient, it was thoughtful, and in many homes it was simply peaceful. People would sit up in bed or beside a low fire. They'd talk, they'd think. Some would go outside for a few moments, walking slowly under the stars, wrapped in heavy cloaks. The streets were silent but not empty. A neighbor might be seen, nodding in the dark. A monk returning from prayer. A baker opening his shutters. Even literature from the time mentions this pattern again and again. In the Canterbury Tales, a character wakes from first sleep and begins a journey under moonlight. In household books there are suggestions for suitable midnight activities: slow reading, prayer, light stretching, quiet conversation. One guide even warned against vigorous sword practice during these hours, suggesting perhaps some young knights needed the reminder. Dreams from the first sleep were said to hold special meaning. People would wake, discuss them, even write them down. A physician in London believed dreams from first sleep revealed imbalances in the body, and the quiet time before second sleep was perfect for understanding what the body was trying to say. These hours weren't treated as broken time. They were sacred time, reflective time. Some believed that God was more likely to listen then, that the heart spoke more honestly in the hush, that creativity stirred more easily when the world had forgotten itself. And then, as quietly as it had come, the watching hour would end. Sleep would rise again, softer this time. Not the heavy fall of first sleep, but a drifting return. Like water settling in a bowl, the room warmed by fire and breath and blankets would grow still once more, and second sleep would carry people into the faint blue edge of morning. This rhythm of sleep and waking wasn't broken. It was the design, an ebb and flow shaped by nature and followed for centuries. It was only with the arrival of artificial light that it faded. With street lamps, gaslight, electric bulbs, the watching hour was pushed out, crowded by busy days and longer evenings. Sleep, once spacious and gentle, was pressed into tighter shapes. But if you've ever woken in the dark, not from fear, not from stress, just awake, and thought it felt strangely peaceful, then you've brushed against something old, something ancient, something medieval. That quiet between sleeps, not a problem, not an error, just a forgotten rhythm waiting in the dark. When the night was truly dark. In our world today, darkness isn't really dark. Even at midnight, the sky glows faintly with city lights. Screens blink on nearby tables, street lamps glow behind curtains, the soft blue of a standby light pulses across the floor. We live with light everywhere, but in the medieval world, the night was different. It was a darkness that went all the way down. When the sun set beyond the edge of the fields, there were no overhead lights waiting to flicker on, no porch lamps, no glowing clocks. Once the day was done, so was the light, and with that deep, absolute darkness came sleep. In a time before electricity, candles were precious. A single beeswax candle could cost a laborer a full day's wages. Even tallow candles, cheaper and smoky, were used carefully. Most homes had only a few, and their light was reserved for important moments. Mending a torn shirt, reading a letter, preparing a simple meal. To use light without need was seen as foolish, wasteful, even disrespectful. Some towns had actual laws about this. In parts of England and France, it was illegal to burn candles past curfew unless absolutely necessary. He who wastes light at night, one record from 1486 warned, steals sleep from his neighbors, because light didn't just cost wax, it cost rest. Even small flames carried far in the dark. A single candle behind a thin shutter could spill into the alleyway, drawing attention, disturbing the stillness. The people of the Middle Ages didn't just live in darkness, they respected it, honored it. They believed it carried its own kind of wisdom, and it shaped everything. Sleep came slowly, gently, as the world grew dimmer. It didn't rush in after a flurry of screen time, or a last check of messages. There was no need to block out artificial light, because there wasn't any. Instead, the darkness deepened room by room. A child might notice it first, rubbing tired eyes as the last bit of daylight vanished from the shutters. Then the hearth would dim, and someone would stir the coals. A candle might be lit for one last task, a bit of weaving, a letter, a prayer, and then snuffed with care. The family would move towards sleep, not as a crash, but as a descent. Darkness brought stillness, and stillness brought rest. Monasteries especially treated darkness with reverence. Within stone dormitories, silence and shadow were strictly preserved. Monks followed rituals to extinguish light at exact hours. Some monasteries even had a designated darkness keeper, a brother whose job was to walk the halls and ensure that no stray flame disturbed the holy rhythm of the night. His lantern was hooded, his steps soft, his task simple, to protect the purity of sleep. And it wasn't just spiritual houses that prized the dark. Even in ordinary villages, homes were built to cradle the darkness. Thick shutters covered windows, interior walls were plastered with light-colored clay to reflect the day's sun, but when evening came, the rooms swallowed the shadows whole. Some houses had alcoves and deep-set beds with curtains, not for luxury, but for warmth and darkness. The body, wrapped in wool and surrounded by shadow, settled more easily. And there was science to it, though they didn't call it that. What we now know as melatonin, the sleep hormone, is triggered by darkness. When modern researchers placed people in environments free of artificial light, they found something curious. After just a few days, their sleep shifted. They began to fall asleep earlier, stay asleep longer, and in many cases, return to that same two-phase pattern medieval people had always known. Our bodies haven't forgotten the dark, we've just drowned it in light. In one quiet letter from 1465, a French noblewoman described her chamber as a place of sacred shadow. She wrote that her best thoughts came not in the morning, not in the bustle of day, but in the hush after sunset, when even her candle dared not flicker. A merchant's journal from Bruges included an odd little entry: slept deeply, no moon, good dark. A simple thought, a powerful truth. Even healing was tied to darkness. Hospitals of the medieval world didn't flood rooms with torchlight, they kept wards dim. Curtains were thick, windows were small and carefully positioned to avoid sunrise directly striking sleeping patients. Records from monastic infirmaries note that patients in darker rooms often healed faster. The body needs not only rest, one monk wrote, but the forgetting of the eye. In our world, we chase darkness with blackout curtains and sleep masks. We buy apps and amber light bulbs and blue light filters to undo what we've added. But medieval people didn't undo anything, they simply lived in tune with the sun and moon. And so their sleep was not something to be hacked or forced, it was something to be welcomed. They let the shadows lengthen, they let the night speak, and when sleep came, it wasn't a battle, it was a returning home to a rhythm that matched the stars. So if you've ever longed for deeper rest, if you've ever turned out the lights and wished the world would stop glowing just for a while, you've felt it too. The memory of true darkness, the quiet it brings, and the sleep that follows. The bed was never yours alone. Imagine stepping into a room at the end of a long day. There's no key, no private retreat, just the low crackle of a shared hearth and a bed that's already half full. Because in the medieval world, sleep wasn't something you did alone. Beds were shared, always, and not just with your spouse. Travelers bunked with strangers, apprentices curled beside their masters, servants and children pressed close to retain warmth. And in the great open halls of noble homes, household members lay side by side, like pages in a book, wrapped in wool and dreams. It wasn't odd, it wasn't rude, it was simply the way things were. Privacy, as we know it, hadn't been invented yet. In medieval inns, it was so normal to share a bed that innkeepers could be fined for not placing guests together. One York inn was scolded in court for offering separate chambers to travelers. It wastes wood and sleep both, the judge declared, when strangers do not share warmth. There was a quiet practicality to it. Fires were small, wood was expensive, homes were cold and drafty. Your best heat source wasn't the hearth, it was the person next to you, and so they slept in clusters. Families huddled close, generations bundled in thick blankets, with the youngest children, who radiated the most warmth, placed in the middle. They were the medieval version of a hot water bottle. Sleep manuals of the time even offered suggestions for who should sleep where. Elderly folk near the walls to stay out of drafts, the strongest sleepers at the ends to buffer movement, and the restless ones tucked gently between calm bodies, like stones settled into riverbeds. In monasteries, records show rows of monks sharing long, narrow beds, sometimes two, sometimes three to a mattress. There were rules, of course. No whispering, no turning too often. And if you left your bed without reason, you might face a small fine. not because they feared disobedience, but because they valued the rest of those beside you. One document warned monks to be still as branches after snow, so that none would wake before the proper bell. In cities, apprentices lived with their masters, often sleeping beside them or with other workers in attics and lofts. A tailor's record from Bruges casually noted that his 3 apprentices rested close, as brothers should. Even noble homes embraced the custom. Noble women often slept beside ladies in waiting, or children. Letters from the 14th century describe beds filled with trusted bodies, and a pleasant warmth from the presence of the living. The shared bed was more than a place to rest. It was a place of stories, whispers, dreams, and memories. People often talked before falling asleep. They shared tales of saints, local gossip, memories of harvests past. Some sang softly, others prayed aloud. And the hush that followed was not silence, but comfort. And it worked. The body, pressed beside others, found it easier to stay warm. Sleep came faster, more deeply, more safely. And while today we might bristle at the idea of sleeping shoulder to shoulder with a stranger, medieval people would likely find our solitary bedrooms strange. To them, sharing sleep was sharing life. In hospitals, patients often bunked 2 or 3 to a bed. It wasn't just for space, it was part of the healing. Nurses wrote that shared warmth helped recovery, and that patients resting beside others often spoke more gently and dreamed more peacefully. There were of course complaints. One merchant described sharing a bed with a vigorous snorer who could wake the dead. His solution: paying extra to sleep alone the next night, what he called a silence fee. Perhaps the first noise cancellation charge in history. And yet, even among the complaints, there's a pattern. People adapted. They learned each other's rhythms. They accepted the gentle rustle of a blanket, the soft breath of someone nearby, the creak of the bed's wooden joints. These sounds became a kind of lullaby. The body, once used to the presence of others, didn't fight it. It folded into the warmth. And when they woke between their 2 sleeps, in that quiet watching hour, there were always others near, awake too, or gently stirring. You were never truly alone. A comfort we often lack in modern bedrooms. One 15th century herbal guide suggests that when sleep is troubled, the presence of another may ease the heart. If your thoughts race, it reads, lie close beside a friend, and speak until the breath slows. There is something deeply human about this, about falling asleep to the sound of another's breath, knowing you are not alone in the dark. In our own time, we chase solitude and silence for better sleep. We design soundproof rooms, buy memory foam pillows, and spend fortunes on ideal conditions. But the medieval world trusted something simpler: warmth, closeness, the company of another heartbeat in the quiet. And in that closeness, they slept, perhaps not perfectly, but peacefully. The town that slept together. Picture a village where the entire world seems to dim at once. Shutters pulled closed with the hush of straw and wood, candles blown out, not in haste, but in quiet ritual. And from one end of the crooked lanes to the other, darkness settles like a blanket over stone and field alike. Because in the medieval world, people didn't just sleep in their homes, they slept together, as communities. Not in one room, but as one rhythm. The streets fell silent, the bells tolled their last for the day, and sleep didn't just arrive, it was welcomed. In most towns and villages, curfew wasn't a suggestion, it was a law. The name itself tells the story. Curfew, from the old French couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire. When the church bell rang just after sunset, every hearth in town was expected to be dimmed, flames smothered, candles snuffed, light withdrawn, not for safety alone, but because it was time to let the body slip into stillness. The darkness that followed wasn't feared, it was familiar, understood, built into the architecture of life. Medieval cities had darkness laws. Yes, truly. In Paris, for instance, all businesses were required to close their shutters and put out any lights after curfew. In London, constables walked the streets to ensure no shops stayed open late, no candles flickered where they shouldn't. Some towns imposed fines for unnecessary light. One 15th century ruling called it a theft of the neighbor's rest. The medieval mind saw sleep not just as personal, but communal. If your fire glowed too long, if your laughter carried past the walls, if your hammer struck iron past dusk, you weren't just disturbing your home, you were disturbing the entire village's chance at peace. In Norwich, records show town criers, reminding residents nightly, let the flame die low, let the eyes find rest, let the hush descend. It wasn't just poetic, it was expected, and so the town dimmed. Markets packed up earlier in winter, when darkness came fast. Inns rationed their candles, lighting just enough to guide a guest to bed. Bakers woke long before dawn to shape their dough in silence, not breaking the communal stillness until the bell for morning prayers rang. Even churches were careful. The stained glass windows that blazed like fire in daylight faded to cold shadow at night. Many were shuttered entirely, and only the low flicker of rushlights guided monks through the cloisters, and when someone wandered after dark, they were noticed. Night watchmen weren't just there to deter thieves, they were keepers of quiet. They listened for what didn't belong, the creak of a wheel, the clink of metal, the murmur of voices too late. In their journals, they recorded not just mischief, but sound. One wrote, "Heard the midwife pass, quiet as a ghost. A dog barked once and no more. All else as it should be." That was the goal. All else as it should be. Still, dark, resting. And the very design of towns reflected this. Streets were narrow, winding, not just for defense, but to block light and wind. Windows were small and shuttered with heavy wood, built to hold in warmth and keep out noise. And many homes had thick interior curtains, creating small cocoons of darkness for sleep. The result, a town that truly slept. Even large cities like Bruges or York would fall into a hush each night. Travelers described the silence as deeper than forest shade, and so quiet the soul could hear itself breathing. In rural hamlets, the hush was even stronger. With no street lamps, no carriages at night, and only the occasional owl to stir the quiet, these little villages became islands of stillness. Even the animals learned the rhythm. Dogs curled by the door, cows fell into rest, roosters waited for the first light, and the people, young, old, rich, poor, all gave themselves to the night together. And when they woke in the middle of the night, during their natural watching hour, they did so gently. No alarms, no harsh lights, just the slow kindling of a rushlight, the soft murmur of cloth being drawn across shoulders, the whisper of a shared word in the dark. A town asleep was not a town inactive, just quiet, just slow. In monasteries, this rhythm became sacred. Monks divided their nights into strict sections of sleep, prayer, and reflection. But even in lay communities, the pattern held. People fell into sleep not when they felt ready, but when the village dimmed. When the bell rang, the doors closed, the fires died. They didn't fight the night, they followed it. There's something comforting in that, isn't there? To think of an entire town, hundreds of souls moving together in one long exhale, surrendering to stillness, not with resistance but with relief. Imagine stepping out your door at midnight, and seeing no light, no traffic, no screens, no movement, just the stars, just the wind, just the quiet. They lived in darkness not as something to fear, but as something to embrace, to rest inside, to recover in. And that collective quiet made sleep not just deeper, but safer, supported, expected. The body learned when to rest, because the world around it rested too. No glowing notifications, no neon signs, no ticking clocks, just breath, straw, stone, silence. The sleep of a village, the sleep of the past, the sleep we might still remember, if we're quiet enough. What they dreamed in the dark. The fire has long gone out. The last ember flickers beneath ash, quiet and pale. Outside the shutters, there is only the hush of wind over rooftops, and the endless dark of the sleeping world. It is the watching hour now. The time between the first sleep and the second, and across medieval villages, someone stirs, not with alarm or confusion, but with quiet purpose. Because this was the hour, not just for waking, it was the hour for dreaming. Not the kind of dreams that rise while you're deeply asleep, but the ones you bring back with you when you wake, the ones you sit with, quietly, under flickering candlelight, wondering what they meant, or where they came from. To the medieval mind, dreams were not random, they were messages, not from the unconscious, as modern psychology might suggest, but from something deeper, sometimes divine, sometimes ominous, sometimes simply wise. Monks wrote entire manuals about dreams, how to interpret them, what they might signify, and when they were most trustworthy. And again, one moment kept appearing in their writings, the interval between sleeps, that quiet hour after the first sleep, when the mind rose slowly out of slumber. That was when dreams were said to carry the most meaning. It wasn't superstition, it was attention, a listening that modern life often forgets. One 14th century herbalist wrote, "The first sleep brings the dream, The watching hour brings the knowing. His advice: rise gently, light a rushlight, sit in stillness, remember what you dreamed, and listen for the thread that ties it to waking life. Letters from the time are filled with such moments. A merchant in Ghent wrote to his brother of dreaming. He stood in the snow with his shoes ablaze. He awoke between sleeps, puzzled, and wrote it down. 2 weeks later, he was summoned to pay a debt he had forgotten, something old and buried. He believed the dream had warned him. A midwife in Cornwall recorded dreaming of standing in a sea of lilies. The next day, she was called to a birth that turned tragic, then turned joyful again. She carried the image with her for years. Some dreams came with instruction, others with peace, and still others with restlessness, that could only be quieted by the watching hour itself. There's something deeply human in this, rising not to rush, but to reflect. In medieval homes, people often kept a small writing board by the bedside, not parchment, which was too costly, but a slate, where they could mark down symbols, thoughts, or dreams in the soft candlelight, before returning to bed. This was not seen as indulgent, it was seen as wise. Monastic records reveal how entire prayer cycles were built around nighttime visions. If a monk had a troubling dream during the first sleep, he was expected to report it, not with fear, but with reverence. Dreams were spiritual weather, and the night was the sky. Even common folk held their dreams with care. A farmer might not know Latin, but he knew the feel of a dream that meant something. He knew to wake his wife and whisper of it, to rise and drink a bit of warmed ale, to sit by the hearth with no fire, and just wonder for a little while, because in the stillness of that hour, it felt like the world listened back. And so sleep was not just rest, it was a journey. You entered the dark, you dreamed, you rose, you reflected, you returned. Even in hospitals, this rhythm held true. Nurses' logs often include notes on patient dreams, recorded not as curiosities, but as clues. Dreamed of water, one entry reads, woke calm and still. Another, dreamed of fire, woke sweating and unsettled, her fever rose by morning. To medieval caregivers, the dream was the body speaking, and the watching hour was its most honest voice. And it wasn't just dreams that took root in that quiet time, it was imagination itself. Writers penned their most thoughtful lines between sleeps. Illuminators added their most whimsical touches by candlelight. There was a quiet boldness that came with being awake when the rest of the world was not. You could think without interruption. You could listen without noise. You could feel the full shape of your own thoughts. Some called it God's hour, others, the silver hour, for the way moonlight fell on stone and skin alike. Whatever the name, it was cherished, and once its gifts had been received, once the dream was remembered, the page written, the thought made whole, the sleeper returned to bed. The second sleep came easily, and more deeply, because the mind had been heard, because the soul had been still, because the night was long enough for both rest and revelation. We often ask what medieval people knew of sleep. Perhaps the better question is, what did they know of night, of listening, of pausing, of letting darkness do more than simply end the day? They knew something we've almost forgotten, that sleep is not just absence, it's presence, and the dark, it isn't empty, it's waiting. A bed built for sleep. Imagine a room without wires, no glowing clocks, no hum of electronics, no blinking lights in the corners, waiting for your attention, only stillness and the deep hush of the medieval night. Now picture the bed. It isn't grand, not by modern standards, no memory foam, no climate control, but it was enough, and more than that, it was made to sleep in. In a stone cottage or timbered hall, the bed was often the warmest place in the home, not because it was soft, though some were, but because it was layered. Blankets of wool, thick and worn, straw mattresses packed tight and stitched by hand, feather beds, if you were lucky. Sometimes ropes, woven across wooden frames, pulled taut and creaking just slightly when you turned. That's where we get the phrase, sleep tight. But it wasn't just about materials, it was about how they used them. Each night, the bedding was shaken out, not just to remove the dust or insects, though that helped, but as a kind of ritual, a resetting of the night. Children helped beat the straw with sticks. Older folk fluffed the woolens near the hearth. Mothers tucked warming stones beneath the covers, stones heated in the embers of the fire, wrapped in cloth. It was quiet work, rhythmic, reassuring, and when the bed was made, it felt earned. Sleep wasn't taken for granted, It was prepared for. In wealthier homes, the bed might be set within a carved wooden frame, curtained on all sides. Not for show, but for warmth and privacy. In colder months, the curtains were drawn tight, and the warmth of breath and bodies would build through the night, like a shelter within a shelter. Even in simpler homes, something similar happened. The bed might be tucked into a recessed nook in the wall, or raised on a loft to capture the warmth that rose, or lowered near the hearth to catch the last of the evening fire. Children and parents often shared sleeping spaces, not out of necessity alone, but from habit, from comfort, from trust. In these arrangements, you didn't sleep alone, and in the medieval world, that wasn't seen as strange. It was seen as smart. Body warmth mattered, and so did the rhythm of sleep that sharing brought. You learned to turn together, to breathe together, to quiet each other's dreams, simply by being near. Bedtime itself came earlier than ours. Sunset meant the start of winding down, and darkness meant sleep. No need for alarms. The rooster was enough, and the body knew when to rise, because it had rested. Before climbing into bed, many families practiced a small routine, not a formal one, just simple, quiet things. A whispered prayer, a bowl rinsed and stacked, shoes placed near the door, a candle snuffed with care, the smoke curling upward like the last thought of the day, and then silence. Not the kind filled with distant cars or hallway lights, but full rich darkness, so dark you could barely see your hand, so quiet you could hear the thatch shifting in the wind, so still that the crack of cooling wood from the fire sounded loud. In that dark, the bed became something more than a place to sleep. It was a little world, and sleep wasn't something to fight for. It came like breath, like the tide, slow, certain, full. You didn't count hours, you didn't check clocks, you trusted the rhythm your body already knew. Even the word sleep held more weight. It meant rest, but it also meant trust. To sleep beside someone was to offer safety. To sleep through the night was to believe morning would come. To sleep well was to be well. No supplements, no apps, just wool, straw, feather, darkness, stillness, and peace. Even now, if you visit some of the preserved medieval cottages, you can see where the bed once stood, slight depressions in the floorboards, hooks where curtains were tied, niches where a candle might sit. The ghosts of bedtime remain, and they tell us something our busy world forgets. A good bed isn't always about softness, it's about slowness. It's about ending the day with calm intention, and waking not with dread, but with quiet readiness. The medieval bed may have looked simple, but it held the sleep of people who truly slept. The sounds of sleep. There's a kind of silence that most of us today have never truly known. Not the silence of city nights, muffled behind double-glazed windows, nor the brief hush between cycles of a refrigerator, or the distant hum of late-night traffic, but a deeper, more ancient quiet, one not made by suppressing noise, but by a world that never created it in the first place. It was into that quiet that medieval people sank each evening, wrapped not in engineered soundproofing, but in the natural stillness of a world lit only by moonlight and warmed by fire. In a simple timber-framed house, set beside a narrow lane, the night would fall slowly, shadows lengthened early, the light fading first from the hearth, and then from the farthest corners of the single-room dwelling. The day's labor would have ended hours before, tools cleaned and hung, animals fed, pots scoured and placed by the door, and then, as twilight deepened, the household began to settle. Voices grew lower, the clatter of the day gave way to the soft rustle of linens being shaken out, the crack of a last log added to the fire. For most, the sounds of the night were not unwelcome. They were not feared or fought, but accepted, even anticipated. The groan of roof beams as they cooled in the night air, the creak of a wooden shutter shifting in its hinge, the steady, rhythmic breathing of a spouse, or child, or cousin, or elder, all tucked close together for warmth. In the darkness, even the slightest sound gained shape and texture, the soft rustle of a sleeping hen in the next room, the whisper of wind beneath the doorframe, the distant, almost imperceptible hoot of an owl far beyond the village wall. Unlike the modern world, where we crave silence as escape, medieval villagers embraced a symphony of natural, domestic, and human sounds. The ticking of a clock had no place here, and the buzz of wires was centuries away. Instead, sleep came in the company of lived sound, low, earthy, and familiar, a pot occasionally rattling on its hook, a dog turning circles near the hearth before settling, a newborn murmuring faintly in its sleep. only to be comforted by a gentle shushing and the warm cradle of a mother's arms. Even the towns, though busier and more crowded, had their own nighttime rhythm. Narrow stone alleys carried the echo of leather boots long after the night watchman passed, his staff tapping out a steady beat. But this was not noise, it was reassurance. With his voice ringing out the hour, 3 of the clock, and all is well. Neighbors nodded in the dark and turned over in their straw-filled mattresses, reminded that someone was awake, watching over them. People in the Middle Ages didn't try to silence their world to sleep. They didn't use machines to drown out noise or apps to simulate nature. They simply lived closer to it. In the quiet of the second sleep, that deep, post-midnight slumber, the night spoke softly to them, and they listened. The house breathed with them, its walls expanding and contracting with the cold. The animals in the adjacent stall shifted on their bedding. A child dreamt aloud in the dark. This symphony of sleep wasn't accidental. Medieval builders, even without formal acoustic theory, understood something we've mostly forgotten, that certain materials, shapes and spaces invite stillness. Thatched roofs and earthen walls muffled outside wind. Thick wooden shutters blocked more than just light. They absorbed the cold and the noise. Stone walls echoed in certain corners, but carried warmth in others. It was not a perfect silence, but a lived one. Sleep, too, was more communal, not just in body, but in sound. Most peasants didn't have private rooms or separate sleeping quarters. Entire families, and often guests, shared a single space. A grandmother's breathing became as steadying as the fire's last embers. The snores of a cousin, the shift of blankets, the occasional half-spoken phrase of someone caught mid-dream. These weren't irritants. They were reminders of presence, of warmth, of the human rhythm of rest. And still, beyond the household, the night made its own music. In spring, the chorus of frogs from a nearby stream filled the hours before dawn. In autumn, the winds moaned through empty trees, carrying the scent of damp leaves and wood smoke. In the heart of winter, when snow muffled even the steps of the watchman, the world held its breath in the hush of frost. It was not the kind of quiet that could be recorded, bottled, or sold. It had to be lived. In some homes, there were small midnight rituals. A father might rise after the first sleep to check the fire, or walk outside briefly, eyes adjusting to the velvet dark. There, he'd hear the deep stillness of a sleeping village, the occasional bray of a restless donkey, or the distant bark of a dog stirred by moonlight. He would return, gently lift the latch, and nestle back beside his family, the cold of the outside slowly melting from his limbs. Monasteries practiced sleep in harmony with sound too. Monks often rose for midnight prayers, moving silently through cloisters in pairs. The shuffling of feet across stone, the soft flicker of a candle being passed from hand to hand, the hum of a psalm in the quiet. These were sacred echoes. Bells tolled carefully, never harshly, calling the faithful from slumber, not with force, but with rhythm. Even medicine recognized the power of sound. Medieval texts advised that sleep be accompanied by low, comforting sounds, the gentle brushing of hair, the whisper of a lullaby, the clinking of herbs steeped in warm wine. Physicians believed certain tones cooled the blood and quieted the mind. Some recommended the sound of water, either from a nearby stream, or for the wealthy, an indoor fountain, so that the sleeper would drift off to its gentle trickling. And then, there were the dreams. People believed that the dreams between the two sleeps, the first and second, were often the most vivid and meaningful. It was during this time, between midnight and dawn, that sleep hovered in a space between waking and slumber. The mind, calmed by the darkness and softened by the sounds of the night, was said to be at its most open. Many believed that in these dreams, answers could be found, and insight gained. Wives whispered such dreams to their husbands. Monks recorded them in journals. Some villagers even sought signs from the divine in what they saw behind their eyelids. For all our modern advancements, memory foam, blackout blinds, white noise machines, it's possible we've forgotten something. Medieval people knew intuitively. That true sleep doesn't come from forcing the world to be silent, but from understanding the sounds it naturally makes. That a creaking beam, a distant owl, the breath of someone sleeping nearby, these are not disruptions, they are lullabies, if we let them be. And as the fire dies low, and the soft hush of the medieval night returns, we might imagine ourselves there beneath rough wool blankets, with the smell of wood smoke in the air, and the sounds of the night not shutting us out, but gently inviting us in. Sleeping with the seasons. Long before the ticking clock, before factory whistles and digital alarms, sleep moved with the seasons, softly, gently, and without resistance. In the medieval world, time was measured not in hours, but in light. The sun was the great divider of the day. and the slow turning of the earth tilted the length of night toward winter and then away again in spring. And people, without ever needing to be told, slept accordingly. In summer, sleep was brief and light. The days stretched long well past what we would now call dinner time, and in some villages the fields were still golden with sun even as children were called in for bed. The sky remained blue until late, and the warmth lingered inside wattle and daub walls, making the evening a time of easy laughter and bare arms, of open shutters and quiet conversations on thresholds. Sleep came later, the air still alive with insects, with the rustle of vines outside windows, with the creak of timber beams gently expanding in the warmth. People might sleep with doors open, if it were safe, or with only a thin cloth draped across the threshold to keep flies from wandering in. Those in the countryside often lay with the scent of cut hay drifting in through the open window, or with the gentle bleat of sheep just beyond the hedgerow. First sleep would begin under a lighter sky, and the night itself seemed shorter, not rushed exactly, but less expansive. And yet, even in the warmth of summer, many still woke after a few hours, just as they always had. The watching hour, what we now call the wakeful middle of the night, felt different in July than it did in January. In summer, it was warm enough to rise without shivering. One might step outside barefoot, feel the dew wet against the earth. The moon cast long silver shadows over gardens and fields, and sometimes neighbors might cross paths at this hour, heading to check on animals, or simply unable to sleep. A nod in the dark, a whispered exchange, then back inside, to the stillness again. But when summer turned, the nights grew long and deep, as if the sky itself were pulling the people of the land into rest. Autumn came first, slowly, gently, and with it a hush. Fields fell silent as the harvest ended, and the days retreated like a tide slipping back. Shadows grew longer, cloaks were fetched from storage, the hearth was kindled earlier, and shutters were closed before the sun had truly vanished. Sleep now came sooner, and it lasted longer. In winter, the very rhythm of life changed. With the sun setting by mid-afternoon in the far north, and the darkness deep by evening, people slept more. It wasn't seen as laziness or indulgence, it was necessity. The body responded to the dark by asking for rest. Some households would begin winding down before supper, voices already quieter, eyes heavy before the pot had finished simmering. They would sleep for long stretches, broken only by the soft hour of wakefulness in the middle of the night. During this midwinter watching hour, people stayed close to the fire. A father might mend a strap or sharpen a tool. A mother might turn over a bit of weaving in her lap. Children, if awake, would be soothed back to sleep by the glow of the coals and the low murmur of adult voices. Some kept journals, scratched carefully onto scraps of parchment, reflecting on dreams, the weather, the feel of the season. There was a slowness to winter wakefulness. The world outside was hushed, frozen in place, and inside, that same stillness stretched long between the hours. Farmers knew, without calendars or clocks, the subtle changes that each season brought. They could feel it in their limbs, in their skin, in the way the house held heat, or failed to. In spring, the light returned like a secret. It crept in slowly, shyly. Morning arrived a little earlier each week, and the birds began their songs again, first uncertain, then more confident. The very sound of the world changed, and with it, sleep shifted. No one had to announce that the night would be shorter. People simply began waking earlier. The animals stirred before they had the week before. The warmth came back into the floorboards. Light filtered differently through the thatch. The body remembered its rhythm, as it always had. Seasonal sleep wasn't an inconvenience, it was a rhythm as dependable as the harvest. The longer sleeps of winter, the light, dream-filled midsummer nights, the transitional rest of spring and fall, each had their place. The body knew how to respond. There were no arguments with the alarm, no bargaining for 10 more minutes, just the understanding that rest and wakefulness flowed like water around the shape of the year. And though they didn't speak of it in modern terms, medieval people knew the value of circadian rhythm. They lived in step with it. A young girl would wake with the sun in midsummer, brush the sleep from her eyes and go barefoot into the garden for herbs. An old man might doze by the fire through the long dark of December, rising for supper, then sleeping again until morning. No guilt, no rush, only the steady turn of time as marked by light. The monasteries, ever conscious of time and season, adjusted their hours of prayer accordingly. In summer, Lauds was called early, before the birds. In winter, matins stretched long into the dark, and monks were permitted more time beneath their woolen covers. The very rules of their strict order bowed to the light and dark, and so even the most disciplined sleepers were allowed to follow the pull of the season. There is something deeply human about this, something we've covered over with electric light and midnight scrolling, and 24-hour productivity. We have tried to outpace the seasons, to flatten time into something consistent, but the body remembers. The body still knows, even now, when it longs for more sleep in winter and seeks shorter rest in summer. Its ancient memory, hardwired, a gift left to us by those who slept with the stars, and maybe, if we listen, really listen, we might begin to hear that rhythm again. In the way our eyelids grow heavy earlier in November, in the sudden sharpness of dawn in April, in the quiet hush of the watching hour, when we wake, not anxious, but expectant, not disturbed, but alive. Sleep in the medieval world was not a problem to solve, it was a tide to ride, a language to learn, and the seasons were its vocabulary. Dreaming in the dark. It's easy, in our world of bright rooms and restless thoughts, to forget that dreams were once seen not as nonsense, but as messengers. In the long, slow nights of the medieval world, dreams held a place of quiet importance. They arrived in the dark, uninvited, but not unwelcome, slipping through the shuttered windows of sleep, and laying their strange pictures across the mind. For medieval people, dreams were not distractions. They were signs, clues, sometimes even guidance. A peasant woman might wake from her first sleep, sit for a moment beside the hearth, and quietly turn over the dream she'd just had. A wide field, a black bird, a face she hadn't seen in years. There was no need to rush. The fire was low, the night was deep, and the second sleep would come soon enough. But first she might whisper to her husband, or perhaps simply tuck the dream away like a folded scrap of parchment in the pocket of her thoughts. Across the countryside, in wooden halls and stone chambers, others were doing the same. A shepherd in the high fells, half waking in the dark, might lie still with the memory of a strange hill or a forgotten voice echoing through his thoughts. A merchant's wife might light a rushlight during the watching hour and write her dreams in a careful hand, believing, as many did, that dreams between sleeps were clearer, truer. The night was not only for sleep, but for messages. The boundary between the waking world and the world beyond grew thinner after midnight, or so people believed, and in that soft, quiet hour, what passed through the veil could be trusted, more so than in the bright, noisy distractions of the day. Doctors kept notes of dreams, monks recorded them, not only for their own reflection, but to better understand the soul. One Benedictine scribe wrote that dreams after the first sleep are sent by God to settle the heart. It was during this time, after the body had rested, but before the sun rose, that people believed the soul walked most freely. Dreams then were not interruptions, they were part of the order of the night. Some even believed that the dreaming mind was more honest than the waking one. A man might deny something by daylight, but dream it true by candlelight. Some trials accepted dream testimony. Some marriages were arranged or called off because of what someone dreamed. And though not all dreams were taken so seriously, there was always a hush around them, a sense that they mattered. Medieval dream books were common, even among those who couldn't read. Passed down by word of mouth or learned by listening, these books were filled with meanings. Dream of running water, and it might mean good fortune. A bridge might be a crossing in life, a change yet to come, a wolf, hunger, a dove, peace. The same image could mean different things depending on the phase of the moon, the day of the week, even whether you were sleeping on your left side. Some dreams were said to come from food, especially cheese, which was thought to bring vivid visions, others from cold air or heavy blankets. But the most powerful dreams, it was said, came naturally, when the heart was still and the night was dark. Many homes had small corners set aside for dream telling. Not official spaces, just little seats by the hearth or low stools by the bed, where someone might sit in the morning and share what their mind had shown them. Children especially were asked about their dreams, for their hearts were thought to be clearer and closer to the world of meaning. A child's strange dream might be passed from house to house, spoken of in markets, or even told to the village priest. And then there were the dreams people didn't speak of. These were often the ones that came again and again. The same place, the same feeling, the sense of standing on a path you had walked before. Medieval people believed strongly in recurring dreams. They might represent a hidden truth, or a warning. One monk dreamed of a crumbling tower for 14 nights. On the 15th, a fire broke out in the abbey wall. Was it a coincidence? Most didn't think so. Others believed dreams were messages from those who had passed on. A mother appearing in a dream to her grown daughter was not dismissed. It was a visit, a check-in, sometimes a warning, sometimes a blessing. To dream of a loved one was often seen as a quiet reminder that the bond was still there, that even across the great divide, love lingered. The structure of sleep itself supported dreaming. With 2 long stretches of rest, separated by a peaceful wakefulness, the mind had space to wander deeply, and then return, slowly and naturally. There was no abrupt alarm, no screen glowing in the dark, just darkness, quiet, and the unhurried drift back into the warm pool of second sleep. Dreams that came in the second sleep were sometimes said to be more playful, more curious, not prophetic, but full of detail and strangeness. The baker's son once dreamed of walking through a city of bread, where towers were made of crust and gates of golden rye. Another boy told of dreaming he'd climbed inside a bell and floated over the fields. These stories weren't mocked, they were part of life. Even if they didn't mean anything, they still belonged to the rhythm of the night. And perhaps most telling of all, dreams in the medieval world were remembered, not because they were unusual, but because they were valued. People expected to dream, they made room for it, just as they made room for waking in the dark, and sitting quietly, and whispering gently beside the hearth. Some monasteries encouraged dream recording as part of spiritual practice, others forbade it, fearing pride or superstition. But even in silence, dreams found their way. They lived in lullabies and folk tales. They shaped decisions and carried comfort. They gave form to fears and offered peace to the troubled. In a world without artificial light, the imagination had freer reign. And so dreams were not chased away at dawn but honored, even if only in thought. A dream could be a mystery to solve, or simply something to savor, like a story half remembered, glowing faintly at the edge of waking. And maybe that's what dreaming really was, in the medieval night. A place between worlds, reached not by force, but by surrender. Not with effort, but with rest. It's still there waiting for us, just past the edge of quiet, in the gentle dark, where second sleep begins. The sound of sleeping towns. Long before the hum of traffic, the distant buzz of electric lights, or the late-night whir of appliances, medieval towns settled into sleep, with sounds that today might be called silence. But it was a living kind of silence. A silence laced with whispers of life, of breath, of wooden beams creaking softly as they cooled in the night air. As twilight faded and windows were shuttered, towns didn't fall silent all at once. The end of the day arrived slowly, like a tide slipping back from the shore. Shops closed with the soft thud of wooden bars drawn across their doors. Bakers laid out their tools for the midnight rise, and one by one, voices fell quiet. Evenings were not loud affairs in medieval streets. The people who lived there respected the dark, not just for safety, but for sleep. The town's quiet became a sort of blanket, settling gently over each rooftop, pressing into every cobbled street and courtyard. And underneath it, life continued, but slower, gentler, in careful, hushed tones. A sleepy town did not mean an empty one. The night watchman would pass by with a muffled bell, his footfalls steady on the worn stone paths. He might call the hour in a low voice, past midnight, and all is well. His voice was not meant to wake, but to reassure, a soft note of order in the dark. In some towns, cats prowled the alleys, their eyes catching the light of a dying fire behind shutters. Dogs slept curled near doors, lifting their heads just briefly at the sound of a distant owl. A single horse, stabled behind a tavern, might shift its weight and knock its hoof against a wooden beam. These were not noises to disturb. They were known, familiar, like the creak of a beloved chair or the hush of wind through the thatch. Inside the houses, the sounds were different, softer still, a gentle rustling of linen, a whispered breath, the slow exhale of sleep from someone lost in a dream. Many families shared rooms, or even beds, so the night sounds were always near, a cough, a sigh, the shift of someone turning over, pulling the blanket tighter. And then there was the fire. Even when banked low for the night, a hearth would still give off its small sounds, a pop, a soft fall of ash, a coal shifting its shape. In many homes, it was the hearth that anchored the sleep of the household, the slow pulse at the center of the night. There were no glowing alarm clocks, no phones buzzing, no humming electronics standing guard in the corners, just the deep dark, and the sounds it allowed. For those who woke between their first and second sleeps, the way so many did in the medieval world, the sounds of a sleeping town became part of the rhythm of night. A merchant might stir from bed and sit on the edge of his straw mattress, listening to the quiet murmur of wind through shutters. A woman might walk softly across a timber floor to tend the fire, careful not to wake the others. In this middle hour, this watching hour, as they called it, the town was both asleep and gently awake. And the sounds that filled it were never meant to startle. They were gentle echoes of a world resting in itself. In monasteries it was different, but not louder. Bells would ring softly to mark the sacred hours. Monks, wrapped in woolen habits, would rise and walk in silence to the chapel. Their sandals made the faintest sounds on the stone floors, almost like whispers of footsteps. Candles flickered, wood groaned in the rafters, and low voices carried chants into the rafters, echoing back down like distant dreams. Even these sacred songs were subdued, not grand or thundering, but thoughtful, woven into the stillness rather than breaking it. It was believed that God himself heard more clearly in the quiet. Some town records tell of mills turning softly in the night, powered by distant streams. The water's flow created a steady, gentle rhythm, like a lullaby for the town. If you lived nearby, you would grow used to it, perhaps even depend on it. Its absence, in times of drought or frost, might feel like something missing from your own breath. In winter, snow changed the sound of sleep entirely. A fresh fall would dampen every step, hush every corner of the world. A man walking home late from the tavern might leave no sound behind him, only the soft press of feet into snow, and the memory of the muffled world he passed through. Birdsong did not break the silence until well after the second sleep had ended. But in the deepest part of the night, there were still voices of nature, owls' nightjars, and the occasional fox calling far away. These too became part of the night's texture, not intrusions, but companions. Children, if they woke, were comforted, not by a glowing nightlight, but by sound. The murmur of parents breathing, the faint creak of rafters, the scratch of a mouse in the thatch, busy with its own tiny world. These sounds were not frightening, they were expected, signs that the world was turning, even in the dark. Even sickness, when it came, changed the night in a known way. Infirmaries and hospitals were never fully still, but their sounds were hushed and constant. A nurse's whisper, a spoon tapping gently against a clay bowl, the soft chant of a prayer for someone in pain. The town's stillness could carry even these sounds without breaking. And if you walked through the sleeping town, rare but not unheard of, you would find it oddly alive, not with people bustling about, but with breath, with life held in stillness. Chimneys sending out thin ribbons of warmth, candlelight flickering behind a shuttered crack, a shadow moving gently on the wall, as someone returned to their second sleep. Modern nights are loud in a different way. Light spills where it isn't needed, machines hum through the quiet, and the silence we do have often feels empty. But in medieval towns, night was a full silence, not absence, but presence. It was a time when every sound mattered, when sleep was folded into the shape of the world, not forced into it. The town slept, and you slept with it, not apart from it. Your dreams were not your own private escape, but part of something shared, something known, something ancient. And as the moonlight touched the rooftops, and the fires burned low, and the last owl called across the fields, the sounds of the sleeping town wrapped around you, soft, steady, and unbroken. Warmth without fire. How they slept through winter. When the winter winds blew through the cracks of wooden doors, and the thatched roofs stiffened with frost, warmth in the medieval world was not something you simply turned on. It was something you shared, something you planned for, something you felt, not just in fire, but in fabric, in closeness, and in the cleverness of old ways. Imagine a small cottage at the edge of a village, its walls made of wattle and daub, its roof low and sloped to keep the snow from gathering too long. The air inside smells faintly of wood smoke and old wool. The hearth glows dimly, its embers tucked beneath a crust of ash to keep their heat. But the room itself, still and cold enough to see your breath drift. And yet, they slept. They slept without radiators, without heated blankets, or thermostats, or thick insulation. They slept through winters long and wild, through snow that stacked at the door and ice that laced the water jugs. How? The first answer was simple. They didn't sleep alone. In nearly every household, beds were shared, not just by couples or siblings, but often by entire families. Bed space was arranged like a puzzle, sometimes with the smallest children placed in the middle, wrapped snugly between older bodies that gave off warmth like living embers. One traveler described this as sleeping in a hive of humankind. But to those inside the bed, it was comfort. Steady, breathing warmth. Not artificial heat, but borrowed body heat, passed like a quiet gift through the night. The beds themselves were deep with layers. Feather beds were rare, but straw mattresses were common, sometimes with dried herbs woven into them to keep pests away and the air fresh. On top, heavy woolen blankets, patched and thick, often stitched by hand over many years. Some families had only one or two such covers, and they guarded them fiercely. A blanket could be more precious than a piece of silver. They also dressed for sleep in a way that might seem strange to us now. Night clothes weren't thin or minimal. They were layered and practical. Linen shifts, woolen stockings, caps to keep in heat. A warm cap was often considered essential. More than one medieval proverb warned, "He who warms not his head shall wake cold-hearted." Some even wrapped their feet in cloth, or tucked hot stones from the fire into the bed before turning in. Hot stones, yes, pulled from the coals, wrapped in thick cloth, and slipped beneath the blankets. They gave off a soft, radiant warmth, just enough to take the chill from the sheets. In monasteries, younger monks were often tasked with warming the senior brothers' beds in this way, carrying the stones carefully, like tiny sons. But the real mastery of medieval warmth wasn't just in materials, it was in timing. People understood how to live with the cold, not fight it constantly. Days were shorter, and activities were planned with light and warmth in mind. Meals were taken earlier, tasks that required precision were completed before sunset, and when night came, it was expected to be cold. It was accepted. Some rooms, like kitchens or common halls, had fireplaces, but bedrooms usually did not. In larger houses, warming pans, metal pans filled with embers, were swept across the sheets before bed. But even then, the heat didn't last long. The real warmth came from the gathering of bodies, the deep weight of wool, and the stillness that winter demanded. And in that stillness, there were traditions. Many families told stories before bed, while gathered in the warmest room. The tales helped pass the time while the fire burned low. Some were old legends, others were family histories. Children would drift into sleep even before the stories ended, bundled in cloaks, heads resting on laps. It wasn't bedtime, it was the closing of the day, together. In villages, communal sleeping wasn't uncommon in winter. Travelers might share a bench by the hearth with a stranger. Inns often placed guests 2 or 3 to a bed, sometimes with only a thin partition of wood or cloth between them. Privacy was a luxury. Warmth was the priority. Even in castles, stone-cold walls were little help against true frost. Tapestries hung not just for beauty, but as insulation. Windows were shuttered with thick wooden boards, and the wealthiest still wore layered sleeping robes, fur-lined caps, and gloves to bed. It was said that even kings could feel the cold of stone in their bones. But perhaps the most curious part of medieval winter sleep was how people adapted their rhythm. The deepest cold came not just with night, but in the hours before dawn, and that was exactly when people were likely to rise from their first sleep and spend an hour or two awake. In winter, this watchful time often took place close to the hearth, where a few remaining embers still glowed. Families might take turns tending it, watching the flames while wrapped in cloaks or blankets. Tea, or rather warm broth, was sometimes drunk, or mulled ale, heated gently by the fire. Quiet conversations were shared, hands warmed by the cup. And then when the fire began to fade, they would slip back into their second sleep. This pattern was so normal, so expected, that medical texts of the time advised against excessive activity during the watching hour, lest the body cool too much before returning to bed. But gentle movement, sewing, stretching, light prayer, was encouraged. People knew how to keep themselves warm, without needing to chase it. In the fields, shepherds and farmers had their own ways. They buried coals in clay pots to carry with them through the night. In some areas, hay was piled in corners of small barns where workers could nap beside their animals. The warmth of a cow or a pig was never wasted. If anything, it was prized. The breath of life was always the warmest thing, and perhaps that is the quiet lesson of medieval warmth. It was not constant, it was not forced, it was shared. It moved slowly, like sleep itself. It reminded people that winter was not to be conquered, but embraced with care. As the cold wrapped the walls, so too did people wrap around each other, with wool, with stories, with closeness. And the sleep that followed wasn't perfect because the air was warm, but because the body knew how to rest, even in the cold, even in the dark. And so they dreamed beneath their blankets of coarse cloth and careful stitches. They dreamed with cold noses and warm feet. They dreamed not despite the winter, but within it. What dreams meant in the Middle Ages. Before the sun rose over frost-kissed fields and sleepy hearths stirred back to life, dreams had already done their quiet work. In the world of the medieval peasant, dreams were not dismissed or forgotten upon waking. They were studied, pondered, and sometimes feared. For in those silent drifting hours between the first and second sleep, dreams were thought to carry messages, whispers from the divine, the soul, or even the dead. Imagine now the stillness of a medieval bedroom. perhaps a shared loft above a cottage, where the fire has long since faded, and the air is cool against wool-covered shoulders. The sleepers lie curled under heavy blankets. One stirs, not from discomfort, but from a dream. A vivid, strange vision, so lifelike it lingers like mist in the early light. He lies there, eyes open to the darkness, wondering what it meant. In the medieval mind, dreams had meaning. They were never just nonsense conjured up by a restless brain. Whether you were a nobleman in a great hall, or a shepherd sleeping under the stars, a dream could be a message worth remembering. People turned to many sources to help interpret their dreams: priests, healers, midwives, and even neighbors. There were dream books passed from hand to hand, copied laboriously by scribes. These books listed symbols and what they might mean. Dream of water, that could mean change. Dream of a tree, that might signify good fortune. A falling tooth, well, best to light a candle for protection. These weren't just idle superstitions. Dream interpretation was taken seriously by scholars and physicians alike. The Som Dial Daniolis, a dream manual named after the biblical prophet Daniel, was one of the most widely read books in Europe for centuries. Even the illiterate heard its contents recited, memorized, and passed along in quiet, curious whispers. And it wasn't just the dream itself that mattered, but when it came. A dream during the first sleep was thought to reflect the body's health. If the images were peaceful, and the mood light, one could assume the body was well balanced. But a troubling dream, of chasing, of falling, of fire or floods, might mean illness was near. Physicians even used these dreams as diagnostic tools, asking patients what they'd seen during the night, to help determine which humors were out of balance. The second sleep, however, that's when dreams were believed to reach their true power. This time, in the small hush between midnight and dawn, was called the watching hour. It was a sacred time, when the veil between the world and the other world seemed thin. People believed that dreams during this second sleep came not from the body, but from the soul. It was during this time that ancestors might speak, saints might appear, warnings might be given. People would wake and remember these dreams with a clarity that lingered far into the day. Some would recount them aloud at breakfast, others would write them down or share them with a priest, seeking interpretation and guidance. In monasteries, dreams were taken especially seriously. Monks kept detailed dream logs, recording not only what was seen but what they felt: terror, calm, awe. Many believed that God could speak through dreams. There were accounts of visions that foretold famine, death, or even victory in battle, all received during the hush between the two sleeps. But not all dreams were divine. The devil, too, could slip into dreams, so they said. He could twist the mind, conjure images of temptation or fear. That's why prayers before sleep were considered vital, a sort of spiritual armor. Parents would murmur blessings over children as they drifted off, warding their dreams from mischief and misdirection. And there was another belief, that the moon could influence dreams. Farmers and midwives alike would mark the lunar cycle, noting how dreams shifted during a waxing or waning moon. A full moon, they said, brought the most vivid dreams, some too strange to speak aloud. In certain villages, it was custom to hang polished stones or iron amulets near the bed during these nights, to catch bad dreams before they reached the sleeper's mind. Even common household items were thought to hold dream power. A pillow filled with lavender might bring peaceful dreams. A bundle of dried mugwort, tucked beneath the mattress, could invite prophetic visions. Some households hung small pouches of herbs over cradles to protect children from night terrors. And always there were stories. By the hearth, families would tell of dreams that came true. A woman who dreamt of rain and woke to the season's first storm. A man who dreamt of wolves, only to hear their howls in the hills the next night. Sometimes the dreams were warnings about fire, or theft, or illness. Other times they were gifts, glimpses of lost loved ones, returned for a moment in sleep. One tale tells of a shepherd who dreamt of a buried treasure beneath a standing stone. He laughed it off, but after 3 nights of the same dream, he walked out to the field at dawn, and found, not treasure, but a long-lost ring belonging to his grandmother. She had worn it every day of her life. He took it as a sign, not of wealth, but of remembrance. Dreams for medieval people were part of the landscape of life. Not strange interruptions, but gentle messages woven into the night. And in the quiet moments after waking, from the first sleep or the second, people would lie in the darkness and reflect, not reaching for a glowing phone, not rising in frustration, but simply listening to the memory of the dream, letting it settle like mist on still water. Because back then, sleep wasn't just about rest. It was a bridge to meaning, to memory, to something just out of reach. And as the dreamer turned once more beneath the weight of wool and straw, they carried that quiet mystery with them, into the deeper dark and back again. Sleep in the monastery, the quiet discipline of night. Long before the rooster stirred in the distant fields, long before even the first light touched the eastern sky, there was movement inside the stone walls of the monastery, not hurried, not loud, just the soft shuffle of sandals across cold flagstone floors, the whisper of robes brushing against wood, and the low rhythmic chant of voices rising slowly in the dark. This was how monks greeted the night. Medieval monasteries lived not by daylight, but by a sacred rhythm, a schedule older than the sun, and stricter than any clock. It was the rule of Saint Benedict that shaped their hours, dividing each day and night into segments of devotion, labor, study, and yes, sleep. But sleep here was never simply rest. It was a spiritual act, a preparation, a pause between prayers, and in that quiet pause, something remarkable unfolded. Let's step into one of these stone sanctuaries now. Imagine the chill of the air, the soft creak of oak beams overhead, the flicker of a single candle set deep in a wall niche. You might hear the faint crackle of its flame, and the silence pressing in around it, full but not empty. Here, in a narrow dormitory lined with straw mattresses and woolen blankets, the monks sleep side by side, not in individual rooms, but in shared open space. They sleep in their habits, ready to rise at any moment. No one speaks, no one stirs without cause. Above each sleeping monk, a small wooden shelf might hold a simple possession, a crucifix, a psalter, or perhaps a small vial of herbs to ease the breath. But the room is bare otherwise by design. Emptiness here is not neglect, it is clarity, a life pared down to the essentials, and the night is one of those essentials. Like the peasants in the villages below, monks too followed a pattern of segmented sleep. First sleep, a gentle descent into rest after compline, the final prayer of the evening. Then, as midnight approaches, the bell calls, a single echoing note drifting through cloisters and corridors. It signals the night office. Vigils. The monks rise without complaint. They do not wipe sleep from their eyes or yawn in protest. This is the hour they've trained for, the hour of deepest silence, of contemplation. They gather in the chapel by candlelight. No torches flare, no rush, just the steady pace of devoted feet. One by one, they enter, bow, and take their places. The chanting begins low and slow, psalms sung not for performance, but for presence, the kind of music that seeps into the stones themselves. These midnight prayers could last an hour, sometimes more, not rushed, not counted down, each word measured, each breath deliberate. For monks, this waking in the dark wasn't a disruption, it was the center of the night, the axis around which their day turned. After the prayers they might return to their beds for second sleep, slipping once more into the quiet beneath thick wool blankets. Or, depending on the monastery's rule, some might remain awake, continuing with reading, reflection, or copying texts by the light of a rush candle. It was during these in-between hours between vigils and lauds that some monks described a peculiar stillness, a clarity of thought unlike any other, a time when distractions fell away and the mind moved like water over stone. No pressing tasks, no sunlight to demand action, just the soft company of darkness and purpose. This was the monastery's gift, a structured night, not a night spent tossing in restless sheets, but a night folded like parchment, shaped by rhythm, intention, and faith. Even their beds were shaped for discipline. Many monks slept on hard pallets, their pillows little more than folded cloth, not out of punishment, but humility, to keep the body light, to keep the mind free. One Cistercian abbey's rulebook specified that monks were not to sleep more than 6 hours a night in total, broken into 2 segments. Yet, reports from the time suggest that monks did not often feel weary. Their bodies adapted, the rhythm sustained them. What seemed harsh to outsiders was, in truth, a kind of balance. Silence too was key. Most monasteries observed a great silence from sunset until after morning prayers. No idle talk, no casual words, just the quiet breathing of sleepers, the rustle of robes, the distant hoot of an owl beyond the walls. This silence wasn't emptiness, it was presence, a way of being deeply in the world, but gently. In winter, when nights stretched long, the rhythm expanded, more time for sleep, more time for prayer, and perhaps, just perhaps, a bit more time for dreaming. One monk, writing in the margins of a manuscript, recorded a dream he'd had between vigils and dawn. He saw a stairway leading up through clouds, lined with lanterns, each flame representing a prayer. At the top, a silence so complete it rang like a bell. He never shared the dream aloud, but the note remains, centuries later, written in careful Latin beside the Gospel of John. It's easy now to romanticize these nights, but they were not always gentle. Cold seeped through stone floors, illness visited often, and yet, the monks endured, not with grim resignation, but with quiet devotion. Sleep in the monastery was not escape, it was sacred pause, a letting go of the world's clamor, a preparation for the next call of the bell. And when the final hour of darkness gave way to dawn, when the black sky softened into blue and birds began to stir, the monks would rise once more, not from restless tossing, but from rest with purpose. They greeted the morning, not with groaning, but with psalms. For them, the night had done its work, not just to heal the body, but to still the soul, and perhaps in their quiet rhythm lies a lesson for us, that sleep is not a failure of energy, it is a rhythm of life, a place to begin again. Sleeping through the seasons, how weather shaped the night, beneath the thatched roofs of medieval homes, long before glass windows and central heating, sleep moved with the rhythm of the weather. It shifted like mist over the moors, shaped by wind and warmth, rain and frost, and all the quiet forces that drifted through the seasons. Tonight, we follow the sleeping patterns not of kings or monks, but of ordinary people, families nestled together in timber-framed cottages, where the nights were long, and sleep was something more than just rest. It was an adaptation, a conversation between the human body and the ever-changing sky. Let's begin in the depth of winter. The wind moans low around the corners of the house, finding its way through chinks in the wattle and daub walls. Inside, the hearth gives off a fading glow, its embers buried in ash, to keep their warmth through the night. Blankets of undyed wool lie heavy on the beds, and sometimes even the animals are brought inside to share the heat. In these darkest months, the sun vanishes early, and returns reluctantly. Sunset might arrive before supper's done, and sunrise won't return until well after morning chores should begin. That leaves a span of darkness so long, it invites 2 full sleeps with time to spare between them. People adjusted without complaint. First sleep came shortly after supper, children tucked in beside older siblings, parents settling in with a sigh, and after a few hours, as naturally as breathing, they'd rise, not fully awake, not fully asleep, just aware, moving softly in the night. Some mended clothing, or stirred coals back into flame, others whispered by candlelight, or prayed in still corners of the home. These were not chores to be checked off, they were simply part of the rhythm. In winter, the between sleep hours stretched longer, shaped by the cold. A little more time to feed animals, to check the thatch for snow, or to write a letter if ink hadn't frozen in its pot. And then, the second sleep would draw them back under thick covers until the cock crowed or the hearth needed tending again. But come summer, everything changed. The sun lingered longer in the sky, dipping low but never quite surrendering. In some northern villages, twilight stretched well past the hour of sleep. People went to bed later, slept shorter, and often skipped the second sleep altogether. It wasn't neglect, it was necessity. Fields needed tending, animals needed milking, and daylight was too precious to waste. Sleep shrank, but so did the need for it. Warm air, open windows, and long evenings brought a kind of waking dreaminess to life. People napped more during the day, under trees, in barns, or even in the cool shadows of churches. Summer sleep was scattered, a little at night, a little in the afternoon, a rhythm in pieces, gentle and irregular, like sunlight dancing on river water. In the spring, sleep stirred with the rising sap in trees. The air was still cool, but it carried promise. Farmers planted by moonlight, believing certain phases of the moon encouraged better crops. Night became a time of both work and rest. A few hours of sleep, then out into the fields to dig or sow by the soft glow of the moon. Some medieval guides even recommended certain herbs, sweet woodruff, lavender, chamomile, stuffed into pillows in spring to calm the senses and invite vivid dreams. Dreaming, after all, was not seen as idle, it was information, a message perhaps, and sleep was the bridge to reach it. Autumn brought a different kind of rest, heavier, slower. The body grew tired with harvest work. The air thickened with the scent of woodsmoke and apples. As nights cooled and grew longer again, sleep deepened. Families often shared a single room, their breath rising in mist above them. They spoke softly as they fell asleep, recounting what had been gathered, what had been stored, and what would be needed to survive the coming cold. Each season reshaped sleep in its own way, not only in length, but in feeling. In winter, sleep was deep and slow, like snow falling silently on fields. In summer, it was light and scattered, like pollen on a breeze. Spring brought curious dreams and fresh beginnings. Autumn closed the eyes gently, preparing the soul for darkness. And through it all, people did not fight their bodies the way we often do today. They didn't force themselves into rigid hours, or chase productivity at midnight. They listened, they adapted, they understood that the sky had a schedule, and they were part of it. Modern homes, sealed tight and lit bright, rarely change with the weather. Our rooms are the same in June as they are in January. But for medieval people, every shift in temperature, every cloud in the sky, touched how they slept, and when they woke. There are records from small English villages, where curfews were adjusted by season, not just to keep order, but to honor the different needs of the body through the year. Bells rang earlier in the winter, later in the summer. It was understood, sleep like the land, must change with time. There's something beautiful in that quiet flexibility, a sleep that breathes with the earth, a sleep that listens. And so, when the wind returns and rattles your window, or the summer sun lingers too long on the horizon, perhaps there's no need to wrestle your rest back into line. Perhaps your body is simply remembering something older than alarm clocks and blue light screens, a sleep shaped by the seasons. The bed before beds, where medieval people slept and why it mattered. Before there were mattresses filled with memory foam, or downy duvets, folded just so, before thread counts and pillow menus, sleep in the medieval world happened in places most of us wouldn't even call a bed. But that doesn't mean it wasn't comfortable. In fact, the medieval bed was something deeply personal, shaped by warmth, habit, family, the quiet wisdom of a different kind of night. Let's step inside one of those long-forgotten rooms now. The house is quiet. The hearth still glows faintly with the day's embers, casting a soft amber light on the floor. The air is cool, edged with wood smoke, and the scent of wool and rushes. In the corner, beneath a small window shuttered with wood, lies the family bed. It isn't a tall four-poster or an ornate frame. It's a simple platform of rope and slats, sometimes just a pallet of straw, laid carefully on the floor, layered with fleeces, spare cloaks, or a thick quilt passed down through generations. And yet, in this modest corner, the family would sleep deeply, tucked close together, with shared breath and shared warmth, listening to the gentle crackle of the fire as night deepened outside. Not everyone had a bed of their own. That wasn't strange. It was expected. In peasant homes, the bed was often shared by the entire family. Parents, children, even grandparents might sleep under the same blanket, not out of poverty alone, but out of practicality, connection, and comfort. Warmth was precious, so was presence. Medieval people didn't view sleep as a solitary act. It was a communal one, a time to rest, not just your body, but your place within the household. Some homes had built-in sleeping platforms, raised from the ground to avoid cold drafts. Others made use of wooden benches, hay-stuffed mats, or even thick furs layered in corners. These makeshift beds might be set up and taken down each day, folded away like memories at sunrise. In larger houses or manors, bedchambers grew more elaborate. Carved wooden frames, linen sheets, heavy woolen blankets, dyed in rich hues. But even in these homes, sharing was common. Guests often slept beside their hosts, servants bedded down just beyond the curtain. Privacy was not expected, warmth and security were. And what about the pillows? Sometimes there weren't any. Other times, they were simply folded cloaks, padded cloth, or sacks of feathers if the household could afford them. In monasteries, monks often slept with their heads on bare wood or a folded robe, considered a reminder of humility. In many regions, children slept in trundle beds that slid beneath the main bed during the day. Others curled into corners lined with woven mats and animal skins. Beds weren't places, they were arrangements, flexible, functional, familiar. And as for the materials, straw was most common. But not just any straw, it was carefully chosen. Oat straw was softer, rye was sturdier. Sometimes it was mixed with dried lavender, sweet rushes, or mint to keep insects at bay, and lend the bed a clean herbal scent, a natural rustic sort of luxury. The phrase "sleep tight" comes from this time. Ropes stretched beneath the mattress had to be pulled taut each night to keep the bedding firm. A loose rope meant a sagging bed, a tight rope meant a restful sleep. Even nobility had to tighten their ropes now and then. Medieval towns often had bedmakers, craftsmen who specialized in ropes, slats and bedding materials, but in rural areas, it was a domestic art. Knowing how to stuff a mattress, layer the bedding, or prepare a sleeping nook was passed from parent to child, like a recipe. In some parts of Europe, beds were enclosed, a kind of wooden cupboard, with doors that shut to keep in warmth. These box beds were especially common in colder climates. Step inside one, and you'd find yourself in a private world, shielded from drafts and noise. A little wooden cocoon of silence. Even inns and taverns weren't places of private sleep. Travelers shared beds with strangers, divided only by a board or a blanket. You paid by the night and the space, not by the room. It wasn't always peaceful, but it was expected, and yet, despite the closeness, people slept well. There was something grounding about it. The creak of the ropes, the rustle of straw, the warmth of bodies nearby, the comfort of hearing someone breathe, or shift, or murmur in their dreams. It reminded you that you weren't alone. Sleep wasn't about isolating yourself in silence. It was about resting within the rhythm of life. Families, workers, travelers, monks, all closing their eyes in rooms without screens, without buzz or glow, just the slow hush of true night. Even the wealthiest beds couldn't match the purity of that stillness. And in that quiet, where moonlight drifted in through cracks in the shutters, people dreamed. Not just dreams of flight or fantasy, but of real things, of sheep on the hillside, of harvests to come, of a newborn's breath against their cheek. The medieval bed wasn't luxurious by modern standards, but it worked, because it offered what we've often lost: connection, simplicity, and sleep without distraction. And maybe, just maybe, it's not the softness of our mattresses or the darkness of our curtains that brings true rest. Maybe it's something older, something smaller, like the sound of someone breathing beside you, or the feel of linen warmed by firelight, or the gentle weight of a blanket that was never just yours to begin with. Midnight meals and sleepy stomachs. How food shaped the night. There's a soft hush across the fields. The stars are out, and the wind has settled into quiet rustles. Inside a small stone cottage, the fire is low, but it isn't out, because in the medieval world, midnight didn't mean silence. It meant supper, or something like it. Long before the modern world told us to stop eating after 8 p.m., before nutritionists warned of late-night snacks and diet plans banished bedtime bites, medieval people understood something we've largely forgotten. Sometimes, a little something in the belly helps you sleep. This wasn't about indulgence, it was about rhythm. Remember, medieval sleep often came in two parts, biphasic, with a waking period in between. And during that in-between time, when the hearth still held heat and the stars looked sharp above the thatched roofs, many families would rise and eat. It wasn't a full meal, it wasn't breakfast either, it was something small, gentle, warming. A bowl of warm pottage left near the fire, bread soaked in milk, a few dried apples, rehydrated and softened in a clay pot, herbs steeped in water, ladled out slowly as you wrapped your hands around the warmth. In wealthier households, there might be roasted chestnuts or cheese and honey. For monks, it could be simple broth. For villagers, it might be what was left of the evening stew, its flavor deepened by slow simmering, just waiting for someone to stir the ashes and wake it gently. There are records of alewives rising between sleeps to check on their brew, sneaking a sip of warm, cloudy beer to steady the nerves and ease back into dreams. Some households shared food as part of this rhythm, a ladle passed, a crust broken. Children half asleep, curled near their mother, accepted a piece of soft bread without fully waking. It was nourishment, without fuss. A kind of edible lullaby. But food between sleeps wasn't just for comfort, it served a quiet purpose. Medical texts of the time suggested warm, easy-to-digest foods helped the body settle into the second sleep more peacefully. Broths and grains were praised. Spices like cinnamon and cloves were thought to stir the blood gently, while herbs like chamomile or valerian calmed the stomach and mind alike. Recipes were passed down not just for taste, but for timing. A 14th century herbal guide recommended a tea of sage and honey to be taken in the hush between sleeps when the fire is low and no words are spoken. It's easy to imagine the quiet, the firelight flickering across wooden beams, the scent of herbs rising from a clay mug held in two hands. Some monks believed the waking hour was a holy time for stillness, and eating too much during it dulled the soul. But even they acknowledged that a spoonful of broth or bite of oatcake might keep the body from distracting the spirit. And while feasts and great meals are often celebrated in medieval history, the These soft, simple foods, the ones taken in silence, in the middle of the night, held their own quiet power. They connected the day before to the day ahead. They marked the midpoint of rest. They were eaten without ceremony, but with great care. And sometimes, they weren't eaten alone. Neighbors rising for similar reasons might share a moment over the low garden wall, exchanging a word, a loaf, a bit of news. In some hamlets, it was common to leave a small bundle of food by the door in case a traveler passed during the night, a gesture of kindness in the dark. The night watchman in towns sometimes carried pocket rations, dried meats, black bread, a little cheese. They'd pause in their rounds to eat under a moonlit archway, listening to the silence of a city at rest. In larger manors or castles, the kitchens never fully slept. The coals were banked, but a servant might still stir a pot or heat a brick for someone's feet. If a child woke frightened or cold, someone might bring them warm milk with ground almonds or honey stirred in. There's something comforting in the image, isn't there? The flicker of firelight, the slow, patient stirring. A world not yet ruled by the clock, where time was measured in bell tolls, and the soft pang of hunger in the dark. There's even an account of a noble woman in 1423 who kept a covered plate of sugared plums beside her bed, not for indulgence, but because she claimed the taste helped anchor her in her dreams. Whether it's true or just a sweet idea, we can almost see her now, half woken in the night, reaching without opening her eyes, the sugar melting slowly as she drifted back to sleep. These quiet medieval meals weren't distractions, they were rituals, grounding the body, quieting the mind, reminding the sleeper that the night was long, but never lonely. And so as you imagine the slow rhythms of that far-off night, bread broken in silence, broth sipped beneath beams darkened with age, perhaps you'll find something to carry with you. Not the meal itself, but the calm, the quiet understanding that sleep is not a race to the morning. It is a passage, with pauses, with warmth, with a little something on the spoon, passed hand to hand in the firelight, before sleep gently takes hold again. How medieval people woke up. The morning rituals you've never heard of. The sky begins to pale. Not suddenly, not like the flick of a switch, but softly, like a candle being lit behind a curtain. The stars dim, the rooftops blush, and in the hush of the old world, the morning stirs. In medieval times, waking up was not an alarm clock's jolt, or the buzz of a screen. It was a slow return to the world, gentle, rhythmic, tied to light, and warmth, and breath. Before the first rooster crowed, before the church bells rang, the first to wake were not always the earliest risers by choice. They were bakers, and monks, and farmers. But even they did not leap out of bed. They stirred, they stretched, they listened. The sound of the coals settling in the hearth, the crackle of dew against the shutters, sometimes a dog's soft snore, or the distant creak of a cartwheel from the road. In a peasant's cottage, waking began with warmth. Often, the youngest or most nimble would be the one to climb from the shared bed first, pulling on wool or linen, slipping out from under thick covers of felted wool or straw-stuffed mattresses. They would bank the fire, or coax it back to life, because warmth meant the day could begin. Sometimes a mother or older child would take this role, quiet in their movements, careful not to disturb others who were still nestled in their second sleep. Then came water, a splash to the face, drawn cold from the bucket, left inside the door, or warm if the fire had been stoked in time. There were no mirrors in most homes, but there was touch, a hand across the brow, a soft comb pulled through hair, a finger tracing sleep from the corners of the eyes. In monasteries, the morning rituals were more defined. The bell rang in the pre-dawn dark, matins or lauds, depending on the hour, and monks rose in silence. The dormitory would glow faintly from rushlights or moonlight seeping through stone slits. They moved as one, cloaked and deliberate, stepping into the rhythm of prayer and song. But not all mornings were solemn. In farmhouses and city homes alike, the first laugh of the day might come early. A child stumbling sleepily into the low table, a rooster that crowed too soon, a gentle joke about the snoring from the night before. Food came next, but not always right away. Some households began with tasks, feeding animals, drawing water, sweeping floors, all done with a kind of slow efficiency, shaped by years of repetition and the steady pace of the sun. Breakfast, when it arrived, was humble, but satisfying. A bit of rye bread from the night before, a ladle of porridge, perhaps a bit of onion, or cheese or ale. Not the sugary, heavy meals of today, but something meant to wake the body gently and fuel it steadily. And as they ate, they talked, quietly, sometimes, but meaningfully. Plans for the day, news from the road, weather signs observed at first light. In towns, apprentices would shuffle from doorways, cloaks drawn tight, merchants unlocked wooden shutters. The scent of smoke and yeast began to drift into the streets. Even in castles, the mornings were not rushed. Servants moved with quiet skill, laying out linens, shaking straw from beds, heating bricks for the cold floors. The noble families would rise slowly, often waiting until the sun had truly lifted before beginning their own routines, washing, dressing, prayers, letters, and sometimes, simply staring from the window as the mist burned off the fields. Medieval mornings were deeply sensory. The feel of frost on a door latch, the scent of a sheep's wool warming in the sun, the low hum of voices from across a field, rising like birdsong, the sight of smoke curling from another chimney, signaling someone else, somewhere nearby, was awake too. And so, waking was not just the start of a new day, it was a rejoining of the world, of the body, of the rhythm, that had never truly stopped, only paused while the stars watched over the roofs. There's something to learn in that waking doesn't have to be sharp and sudden, that a day doesn't have to begin with urgency or alarms, that perhaps, if we allow ourselves the space, we too might wake as they once did, with breath and warmth and patience, not racing ahead, but arriving gently, just in time, as the world stirs and opens its eyes. The sleepy science of straw beds and wool blankets. Why medieval comfort was smarter than it looked. Imagine lying down after a long day's work, not on memory foam, not on a feather bed, but on a mattress stuffed with straw, resting on a wooden frame, warmed by the steady weight of layered wool blankets. It might not sound luxurious, but in the quiet corners of the medieval world, this was comfort at its finest, and it was far more clever than it seems. You see, medieval sleep wasn't about softness, it was about balance, warmth without overheating, cushioning without sinking, a bed that breathed with the seasons. And as strange as it may sound, these rustic sleep systems were designed, intentionally or not, with a wisdom our modern bedrooms often forget. Let's begin with the mattress. The most common kind in medieval homes was a pallet, often stuffed with straw, hay, or even dried rushes. It was called a litter, and it wasn't flat like modern beds. It sloped gently, slightly higher at the head. The straw was bundled into thick, breathable sacks, sewn from linen or hemp. These were placed either directly on the floor or atop a simple wooden frame called a bedstead. And every few weeks, especially after harvest, the straw would be changed out. Families would gather the old stuffing and refill their beds with sweet-smelling chaff, cut herbs, or sometimes dried lavender or mint if they could afford it. The scent served a purpose, calming the nerves, keeping pests away, and marking the turn of the seasons. Some wealthier homes used feather beds, layered above the straw for extra cushioning, but these were rare, and almost always inherited, treated like family treasures. For most, the humble straw mattress, if kept dry and aired, was enough. And then came the bedclothes, wool blankets, layered thick, woven heavy, and made to last through long, bitter winters. Wool was the wonder fabric of the medieval world. It was insulating, water-resistant, breathable, and almost magically good at regulating temperature. A single blanket could keep you warm through a night of frost without making you sweat. Even better, it worked in layers. A child might be tucked under 2, an elder, perhaps 4 or 5. In monasteries, records show monks sharing tightly woven woolen covers, designed to be light on top and denser near the feet, because feet, as everyone then and now knows, are the first to grow cold. Sheets, if present, were made of linen, cool to the skin, easy to wash, and surprisingly durable. In peasant homes, sometimes they used only a plain cloth between the body and the straw, just enough to feel clean, but not too delicate to wear. And here's something many don't know: medieval beds were often curtained, not for decoration, but for insulation. Heavy drapes made of wool or thick cloth were drawn around the bed to trap warmth and block drafts. Even in the coldest stone rooms, a curtained bed could feel like its own little world, a pocket of warmth in a chill and shadowed house. People called it a bedstead with tester, and those who had one treated it like a sacred space. Inside, the world slowed, voices grew quieter, candles flickered lower, and outside the curtains, the rest of the room dissolved into darkness. It wasn't just physical comfort they crafted, it was psychological comfort too. Sleeping in the medieval world was not rushed. It wasn't squeezed into the edges of an overstuffed schedule. It was given its own rhythm. And the beds, those humble constructions of wood, straw, wool, and cloth, were made to support that rhythm gently and completely. Even the way people laid themselves to rest was intentional, backs slightly elevated, legs not fully straight, arms crossed lightly, or tucked beneath the blankets. In monasteries, monks were instructed to lie as if already at peace, as if sleep were a practice for the soul's deeper rest, and perhaps, in the stillness of those long nights, surrounded by the scents of herbs and wool and wood smoke, with the silence only broken by the wind in the thatch or the creak of timber, perhaps that's exactly what it became. Not just sleep, but sanctuary. In a world without white noise machines, people fell asleep to the real sounds of the world, to the breathing of their loved ones, the rustle of the straw, the crackle of a dying fire. There was no need for perfection, no pressure to optimize every moment of rest. They simply slept, deeply, fully, naturally. So tonight when you curl under your covers, think of them, those quiet sleepers from centuries past, wrapped in wool, dreaming in straw, listening to the night pass gently by. And remember, perfect sleep doesn't always require perfect things. Sometimes, it only needs warmth, weight, and a little darkness to hold it all. Midnight meals and moonlit bread, how food and sleep were secretly connected. It's easy to imagine that medieval life ended with the sunset, that after a long day in the fields or at the hearth, people simply curled up and drifted off until morning. But in truth, the night was not so quiet. In those deep hours between first sleep and second, something delicious often happened. Bread was rising, ovens were warming, and soft footsteps moved through kitchens lit only by rushlights and fading embers. Tonight we step quietly into those kitchens, into a time when food and sleep dance together in a rhythm our modern world has mostly forgotten, because in the medieval world, midnight was not only a time for prayer or contemplation, it was, surprisingly often, a time for eating. These weren't grand meals, no roasts or feasts, just small, simple things. A slice of coarse bread with a bit of fresh curd, warmed broth poured from a covered pot, a spoon of stewed apples or honeyed oats left simmering near the hearth. What we'd now call a midnight snack, they might have called a comfort. And it was no accident. People knew their bodies well. They noticed that the waking hour between first and second sleep sometimes came with a faint hunger, not the kind that growls or aches, but the kind that stirs gently in the belly and asks for something warm. Bakers, of course, were the first to stir. The medieval baking day often began long before dawn. In small villages, the baker's oven was a central place, sometimes shared by multiple households. Families would bring their prepared dough wrapped in cloth, marked with a family symbol carved into the crust. These marks told the loaves apart as they baked, side by side, in the great brick ovens. But before that could happen, the fire had to be kindled. This meant the baker, or often his apprentice, would rise in the deep hours, sometimes even before first sleep ended. They would stoke the embers, feel the stones for heat, and begin preparing the flames for the day's first loaves. As the fire grew, so did the scent. Smoky, earthy, a hint of grain and wood, it drifted through shuttered windows and into the still night, a quiet promise of warmth. And those nearby, especially those already awake during the watching hour, sometimes couldn't resist. Some households kept small stores of dried fruits or cheese within reach of the bed. Others would slip quietly into the kitchen to stir the coals, check a bubbling pot, or gently reheat something from the day before. It wasn't considered indulgent. It was practical, thoughtful, human. And more than that, it may have been healthy. Modern researchers have found that small warm foods during the night, when chosen carefully, can actually aid the return to sleep. Gentle proteins, slow digesting grains, even a bit of honey can nudge the body back toward rest. It's not hard to imagine that medieval people, guided by instinct rather than data, already understood this. In monasteries, records show that infirmary monks often gave patients warm milk or herb-infused broths between sleeps. These weren't full meals, but little restoratives, just enough to soothe the stomach and quiet the mind. Some recipes even survived. A mixture of warm goat's milk, crushed poppy seeds, and a thread of honey. Or a barley drink steeped with chamomile and fennel, known to calm digestion and soften dreams. For those working the ovens, though, the rhythm was more than medicinal, it was sacred. In the stillness before dawn, bread was not only food, it was ritual, kneading the dough by candlelight. Feeling the rise, listening for the tiny sounds that signaled readiness. Every step had its place, every gesture its meaning. There was something deeply peaceful in that slow, quiet labor. Some bakers wrote in the margins of their records that they preferred these hours, the world asleep, the sky still black, the kitchen warm with promise. They spoke of dreams carried in flour, of prayers whispered as they shaped each loaf. They believed, perhaps rightly, that bread baked in silence carried a different spirit. And so, in the hours when the rest of the village still dreamed, the baker's hands moved through dough like an artist, pressing centuries of knowledge into each fold and turn. When the sun rose, the air would be filled with the scent of crust and crumb. But in those midnight hours, there was only quiet. The hush of flour falling, the creak of the oven door, the steady rhythm of old familiar work. And for those still resting nearby, that scent, just a hint of it drifting through the walls, was its own kind of comfort. It meant the day was beginning again. It meant someone was awake and tending to the world. So tonight, as you lie in your own warm bed, think of those long-ago kitchens, of the gentle hunger that stirred after midnight, of the hands that shaped dough while the stars still hung low in the sky. And perhaps, if you wake in the quiet dark with your mind softly wandering, you might remember that this too is part of the rhythm. A time not to fear, but to savor. A time made in the old world, for stories, for prayer, and for bread. The watching hour. How midnight became sacred. In the stillness between sleeps, when the world outside fell into its deepest hush, medieval people opened their eyes, not in fear or frustration, but in reverence. This time, the space between first and second sleep had a name. They called it the watching hour, and to them, it was not strange to wake in the middle of the night. It was expected, honored, sometimes even cherished. Let's step into that silence now, and see what they saw. Imagine it, a modest cottage, or a quiet monastery, walls thick with stone and straw, the only sound the soft creak of beams or the wind curling gently around the eaves. Somewhere in the dark, someone stirs, but they don't toss or turn. They don't check a glowing clock or reach for a screen. Instead, they rise slowly, calmly. They light a single taper. They sit near the hearth, not to chase away sleep, but to sit with it. This was the watching hour, and it was a time apart from the rest of the day. The watching hour had many purposes. In rural households, it was often a time of quiet work. Someone might repair a worn strap or thread a needle in the low light. Children who had trouble falling asleep again might be gently rocked and told stories, their dreams shaped by whispered legends and half-remembered songs. In monasteries, it was something altogether deeper. Here, monks rose with ritual and intent. The rule of Saint Benedict, one of the foundations of monastic life, called for vigils in the middle of the night, a deliberate awakening, a return to consciousness, not for labor, but for prayer. In the chapel, candles were lit with care, psalms were chanted in low voices, rising like mist into rafters shrouded in dark. The prayers spoken during these hours were believed to be more potent, more pure, closer to the veil that separated the earthly from the divine. Some monks wrote of this time as the thin hour, when heaven seemed closest, and the soul most clear. But even outside the cloister, this sacred watch had meaning. Household books written for women of the manor sometimes recommended spiritual reading, or silent reflection during this time. One passage suggested that thoughts rising in darkness are truest, being free of the burdens of day. Letters and diaries speak of quiet revelations. A merchant once wrote to his brother that he solved a troubling problem with his accounts not by toiling during the day, but by waking and thinking clearly in the deep time between the lamps. The watching hour became a kind of pause, a moment to be, not productive, not busy, but simply aware. Even doctors spoke of it with respect. Medical texts from the 13th and 14th centuries described this waking as a natural reset. Some physicians advised patients to gently stretch, to walk slowly across the room and back, or to sip a warm drink. One wrote that the soul takes breath in this hour, and recommended quiet company over solitude when possible. It was in many ways the original mindfulness. No agenda, no goals, just being awake in the quiet dark, and it mattered. Because in a world without electric light, time felt different. Midnight didn't blur into one long dark stretch. It was made of pieces, layers. First sleep, the watch, second sleep, and in between, this pocket of stillness that belonged to no one else. Some called it God's hour, others, simply the pause. But whatever name it wore, it offered something our modern nights rarely do, a space without demand. No phones, no expectations, no need to explain why you were awake. You just were. In one old town ledger, a scribe wrote that he re-inked the ledger by moonlight and recalled all the numbers without effort. He didn't call it insomnia, he called it blessed clarity. Another record from a small abbey speaks of a monk who would sit by a window, wrapped in his cloak, quietly watching stars shift across the sky. He described them not as distant lights, but as companions. Each one, he wrote, a bell calling me to peace. And that's what the watching hour was for many, not a disruption, but a return. A return to thought, to spirit, to softness, a reminder that not all waking is work, and not all stillness is sleep. So if you find yourself awake in the middle of the night, in that liminal space between dreaming and day, remember the ones who came before you, those who stirred not with frustration, but with purpose, who lit a candle, or whispered a prayer, or simply sat and watched the world breathe. You too are in the watching hour, and in that hour, you are never truly alone. Of dreams and remedies, how the night revealed the body's secrets. In the quiet of a medieval night, when the wind pressed softly against the shutters and the hearth had settled into a low orange glow, sleep was not simply rest. It was a form of listening to the body, to the spirit, and perhaps most mysteriously of all, to dreams. In the time between the first and second sleep, medieval people believed the night spoke in symbols, and they listened closely. Doctors of the age wrote extensively about this. They weren't just healers of flesh, but interpreters of sleep. One 14th century medical text, weathered with soot and thumbprints, described dreams as whispers of the humours. The body, they believed, sent messages through visions, and the hour between sleeps was the time to understand them. Let's walk through that space now, into a simple sleeping chamber, lit only by a small rushlight. A man wakes, blinks slowly, and rubs his eyes. He's not startled by his waking, it's expected. He sits upright and remembers a dream, a tree growing upside down, a well that bubbled, then stilled. He reaches for a small wax tablet and writes it down. Later he will show it to his physician, and that physician, trained in the complex language of medieval medicine, might say the bubbling well suggests the liver is disturbed. The stillness after is a good sign. Balance returning. These weren't wild guesses. They were part of a whole philosophy of healing. The body was thought to be governed by four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and dreams were believed to reflect imbalances between them. The night's rest, then, wasn't passive. It was diagnostic, and not just for doctors. Midwives, too, understood the signs. A pregnant woman who dreamed of birds nesting in her hands might be told she would give birth safely. But if she dreamed of winds blowing through a hollow house, the midwife might prepare carefully, watching for signs of trouble. Sometimes these interpretations were passed down in families, whispers shared between mother and daughter, grandfather and child. The dream of a black dog, good for some, ominous for others. A vision of clear water, almost always a blessing. And what's remarkable is how calm and thoughtful these interpretations were. There was no rush to explain away every vision, no fear of a restless. Instead, people kept track of dreams like you might keep a weather journal. Some even believed certain herbs brought clearer dreams. Mugwort was one, a soft silvery plant often dried and hung above the bed. It was said to bring truth in dreaming. Valerian too was cherished, not just for calming the nerves, but for quieting the mind before first sleep. Doctors advised patients to sleep with their heads slightly elevated if they wished to dream clearly. Let the humours flow gently downward, one physician wrote, so the visions may come pure and without muddle. Hospitals at night were their own world entirely. Records from a London infirmary show that nurses were trained to observe patients closely between sleeps. They speak more truly, one wrote, when they think themselves alone. The in-between time was when symptoms surfaced most clearly. A woman might wake between sleeps and confess to a nurse the true depth of her pain, which she had hidden all day for fear of losing her place in the ward. A child might speak of colours in his dreams, and the monk physician would make a note, watch for fever tomorrow. Even the layout of medieval hospitals reflected this understanding. Beds were arranged not just for space, but for sound. Doctors noticed that quiet patients often fared better, and so curtains were drawn not for privacy, but to muffle the breath and dreams of the man in the next bed. Silence, it seemed, was medicine. There were also gentle remedies offered during the watching hour. A warm cloth steeped in chamomile and placed over the chest. A cup of milk stirred with cinnamon and honey. Soothing, comforting, easy on the stomach. And always the steady presence of a nurse or monk, watching from the shadows, making notes by candlelight. One journal entry reads, "Brother Elric murmurs of apples again. No fever. Perhaps childhood memory. Observe again next night." It was not a time of panic. It was a time of paying attention. Because in the medieval mind, Sleep was not a simple switch from waking to dreaming. It was a procession, a sacred rhythm, and the hour between the wakeful pause was a doorway, not only into the soul, but into the body's deepest truths. Perhaps that's what we've lost most of all. Not the dreams themselves, but the space to notice them. The willingness to sit quietly in the night and say, what is my body telling me? What does this dream mean? What does my spirit need? In the still hours of medieval darkness, these questions were not just permitted, they were expected. And in that gentle pause, in the hush between two halves of rest, healing began, not just with herbs and warmth, but with listening. The sleeping chamber. How the medieval bedroom was built for rest. The room is quiet, no ticking clocks, no humming wires, no glowing screens, just the hush of rush straw underfoot and the soft creak of beams overhead. This is a medieval sleeping chamber. And though it may look humble by modern standards, low ceilings, heavy wooden shutters, a simple bed tucked into the corner, what you'll find here is something surprisingly rare today, a space built entirely around the idea of true, restorative sleep. Let's take a slow step into the room. The floor is covered with straw, sweetened with dried lavender or mint from the garden. It muffles sound, traps warmth, and keeps bare feet from the cold stone beneath. Over time it's changed out and repacked, a living floor, always in quiet conversation with the seasons. The air smells faintly of beeswax and herbs. The candles, if they are lit at all, are few and precious. Most medieval homes would have used rushlights at night, slim reeds dipped in tallow, slow burning and easy to make, one on the windowsill, maybe another in a simple iron holder on the wall. The bed itself, not grand but purposeful, a heavy wooden frame raised slightly from the ground to avoid drafts. Ropes crisscross the frame to support the mattress, woven tight and occasionally tightened with a simple wooden key. It's where the phrase "sleep tight" comes from. The mattress is stuffed with straw, feathers, or sometimes wool, depending on the family's means. Some are layered, straw on bottom, feathers on top, adding both comfort and insulation. And over it all, thick linen sheets, washed in hot water and dried in the sun. Blankets are heavy, made of woven wool, sometimes fur, but perhaps the most important feature of the medieval bedroom is what it lacked. There was no clutter, no shelves of unread books, no flashing lights, no piles of unfolded laundry. The sleeping chamber was for sleeping, and if you shared the space as most people did, you developed an almost musical rhythm to it, turning slowly, breathing in harmony, adjusting blankets without stirring others. In many homes the whole family might sleep in a single room, children bundled at the foot of the bed or across from the hearth, grandparents by the warmest wall, and the quiet murmur of night settling over them all like a second blanket. If it was a wealthier home, you might find a bed enclosed in wood, a box bed or a curtained alcove. These were not only luxurious but practical. The heavy curtains trapped heat, kept out drafts, and created a pocket of darkness even in the brightest daylight. Some beds had canopies hung from the beams above, not for decoration, but to catch falling dust from the thatched roof. Even in monasteries, where simplicity ruled, the dormitories were designed with care. Each monk had a narrow bed, a blanket, and sometimes a small candle niche built into the wall. There were rules about silence after nightfall, no speaking after the bell, no unnecessary movement. The night was not to be disturbed, and beyond the walls, the streets fell quiet too. City charters from the 13th and 14th centuries show curfews strictly enforced, not only to prevent crime, but to preserve the darkness and silence needed for sleep. Inns and taverns were fined for noise. Even church bells were muffled after a certain hour. The world, quite literally, made room for rest. In winter shutters were barred tight against the cold. Some were lined with cloth or stuffed with wool to keep drafts out. In summer they might be cracked open slightly, to let in a breeze, or kept closed to hold the cool of evening inside. And always there was an attention to temperature and timing. Before the first sleep, people often warmed their feet by the hearth, or soaked them in warm water with a pinch of sage. A wool cap was worn to bed, not just for comfort, but because it was understood that heat left the body through the head. A cold head meant a restless sleep. Even the colors of the chamber played a part. Walls were whitewashed or coated in pale lime plaster, reflecting candlelight softly, never harshly. Tapestries hung on the walls were not just decoration but insulation. They softened sound, kept out the damp, and above all the medieval bedroom was dark. Not pull the curtains dark, not put your phone down dark, but complete darkness. The kind that wrapped around you, the kind that allowed your mind to rest deeply without interference. In that total darkness, melatonin production wasn't interrupted. Sleep came easier, dreams came clearer, and the body, responding to these ancient signals, eased into the first sleep like a boat drifting with the current. Then, around midnight, the room would stir. A soft cough, the rustle of linen, a flicker of light as a rushlight is relit. Some would rise for prayer, or quiet conversation, or to tend a low-burning fire. Others simply lay still, eyes open, listening to the quiet, waiting for the return of second sleep. And that pause, that sacred in-between space, wasn't considered lost time. It was part of the sleep, part of the rest. The room held it, shaped it, invited it. Everything about the sleeping chamber, its silence, its softness, its darkness, was an invitation to deeper rest. We might not be able to live exactly as they did, but perhaps we can learn from the shape of their rooms, the quiet of their nights, the rhythm of their bodies, and little by little, find our way back toward rest that feels whole. Midnight tasks. What people actually did between sleeps. The fire is low, the room is wrapped in a hush, but it's not asleep, it's waiting. This is the time medieval people called the watching hour, that curious pocket of wakefulness that appeared like clockwork between their first and second sleeps. Today, we might call it insomnia. Back then, it was simply part of the night. A rhythm so natural, so expected, that entire routines unfolded quietly in these dark, gentle hours. And tonight, you're invited to wander through them. Step softly. The rushlight flickers in a corner of the room, casting a thin, golden glow. Someone has stirred from bed, not startled or restless, but calm, with purpose. They reach for a small bundle near the hearth, a bit of thread, an embroidery hoop, a soft piece of linen, no words spoken. Just the faint snick of thread being drawn, and the slow rhythm of the needle slipping in and out. This isn't a chore, this is peace. Across town, in a narrow alleyway, a baker lifts the lid on a rising batch of dough. The yeast has worked slowly during the hours of first sleep. Now, in the watching hour, it's ready to be kneaded and shaped, baked at dawn. The baker's hands move with practiced ease. This is his quiet time. No noise, no crowds, just the comforting creak of the oven and the soft thud of dough hitting the wooden board. Farther down the lane, in a stone house with thick shutters, a mother lights a tiny rush candle. Her youngest stirs beside her, half asleep, and she gently pats the child's back, humming softly under her breath. This time between sleeps is when worries feel smaller and thoughts become clear. It was when people talked about their dreams, wrote letters, whispered prayers, and the prayers weren't rushed or distracted. They were deep, deliberate, whispered into silence. Monks across Europe used this hour for vigils, the night office of prayer. Candles flickered in long stone corridors as footsteps echoed off cold walls. Ancient chants rose softly through the dark. They believed that the soul, half detached from the body in sleep, could see more clearly in the stillness of midnight. In many homes, this hour was also practical. A craftsman might check his kiln, or adjust the coals in a long-burning hearth. A weaver might count her threads. A merchant might sit near a small window, ledger open, scratching quietly with ink and quill, doing math by moonlight. Not because he couldn't sleep, but because he could think. Even in rural cottages, this time had its rituals. A farmer might rise to check the animals, move a lamb closer to its mother, warm a newborn piglet near the fire. In spring, seeds soaked in warm water overnight were checked. In winter, snow was shaken from the roof to lighten the load before dawn. The watching hour was rarely wasted. It was considered a gift, and people moved through it with the same softness they used to enter and leave sleep. Some lit no candles at all, choosing instead to sit near the hearth or look out a narrow window at the stars. There are letters, real, handwritten letters, from noble women, who describe this time as when the soul speaks gently to itself. One countess even claimed her best poetry came during these hours, and only then, not hurried, not planned, just arriving quietly in the dark. And it wasn't just the elite. Even peasant homes were alive in subtle ways. You might hear the gentle clink of iron tools being adjusted on a peg, the soft scuff of someone sweeping a hearth, the quiet comfort of a whispered story passed between blankets. Some even believed it was the best time to conceive a child, not just for privacy, but because the body and spirit were more at peace. And though medical texts from the time knew nothing of hormones or brain waves, they described this hour with eerie accuracy. A time of clarity, a time when the blood was still and the mind untroubled, a time when the air in the home felt different, cooler, quieter, sacred, somehow. Not all midnight tasks were productive, some were simply human. A man watching the flames flicker low, his dog curled at his feet. A girl sketching in the margin of a household ledger, careful not to wake her father. A grandmother rubbing balm into her hands, muttering about the coming rain. All of it part of the rhythm, part of the pattern. And when the body felt ready again, people returned to their beds. No shame, no frustration, just the next part of sleep. The second sleep, the deeper one. One monk wrote that dreams from the second sleep often carried more truth than words spoken at midday. And as the fire settled to embers and the rushlight was pinched out between damp fingers, the home would slowly exhale. Blankets pulled up, pillows fluffed, a few whispered words exchanged across a room, and then, nothing, just breath, just sleep, until the roosters called morning back into the world.